The fluorescent lights at the federal courthouse in Brooklyn cast harsh shadows across the witness stand on March 2nd, 1992. In the gallery, reporters leaned forward, their pens poised above notepads, knowing they were about to witness history. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with the weight of decades of silence about to be shattered. Before we dive deep into this incredible true story that spans decades of power, loyalty, and ultimate betrayal, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. This is the perfect story for late night listening, something to let wash over you as the world grows quiet around you. If you're settling in for this journey with me, hit that like button. Share this with someone who appreciates real stories about real people, and make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to spend the next few hours together exploring one of the most fascinating and complex figures in American crime history. Now let's go back to March 2nd, 1992. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. Across the courtroom, sitting at the defense table with his perfectly styled hair and $1,000 suit, was John Gotti, the man who had once been his boss, his friend, his brother, in the most violent family America had ever known. The dapper Don's eyes burned with a fury that could have melted steel, but Sammy didn't flinch. This was the moment that would break the ancient code of omerta, the sacred vow of silence that had protected the American Mafia for nearly a century. When Sammy opened his mouth to speak, he wouldn't just be testifying against John Gotti. He would be pulling back the curtain on a world that had operated in shadows, revealing secrets that men had killed for, died for, and lived their entire lives to protect. The prosecutor's first question cut through the silence like a blade. "Mr. Gravano, what was your position in the Gambino crime family?" Sammy's voice was steady, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than dismantling an empire. "I was the underboss under John Gotti." And with those 9 words, everything changed forever. But to truly understand how we arrived at this moment, this ultimate betrayal that would send shockwaves through the criminal underworld and forever alter the landscape of American organized crime, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the streets of Brooklyn, where a young boy named Salvatore Gravano first learned that in his neighborhood respect wasn't given, it was taken. The year was 1945, and America was celebrating victory in a war that had changed the world forever, but in the narrow streets of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. A different kind of war was always being fought, one where territory was measured in city blocks. Respect was currency, and violence was just another tool of trade. Salvatore Gravano was born on March 12, 1945, into this world where the line between right and wrong wasn't drawn by law books or moral teachings, but by neighborhood rules that had been passed down through generations of immigrants who had learned that sometimes survival meant making your own justice. His parents, Gerardo and Caterina Gravano, had come to America with the same dreams that had driven millions before them, a promise that hard work could build a better life. Gerardo worked as a house painter, his hands permanently stained with the colors of other people's dreams, while Caterina tended to their small apartment and raised their children with the fierce protectiveness that only a mother in a rough neighborhood could understand. The Gravano family lived in a modest 2-story house on 86th Street, in the heart of what locals called the neighborhood. This wasn't just any Brooklyn neighborhood. This was Bensonhurst, where the old ways still mattered, where your word was your bond, and where disrespect could cost you everything you had. From his earliest memories, Sammy was different from other kids. While his classmates played stickball and traded baseball cards, he was studying the adults around him, watching how they moved, how they talked, how they commanded respect. Even as a child, he understood that respect was the most valuable commodity in his world, more precious than money, more powerful than any weapon. The neighborhood was a patchwork of working-class families, many of them Italian immigrants who had brought with them not just their traditions and recipes, but also their understanding of how the world really worked. They knew that sometimes the Police couldn't help you, that sometimes the courts didn't deliver justice, and that sometimes a man had to take care of his own problems. Young Sammy absorbed these lessons like a sponge. He watched as certain men walked through the neighborhood with an almost regal bearing, how conversations stopped when they approached, how even the toughest guys on the block showed deference. These weren't men who worked with their hands like his father. These were men who worked with their minds, their connections, their ability to solve problems that other people couldn't solve. The Gravano house was always filled with the sounds and smells of the old country. Caterina would spend hours in the kitchen, preparing elaborate Sunday meals that brought extended family together around a table, where business was discussed in whispers, and children were told to eat and listen, but never to repeat what they heard. It was at these Sunday dinners that Sammy first began to understand the complex web of relationships that governed his world. Uncle Sal wasn't really his uncle, but he was family in a way that transcended blood. Cousin Tony had connections that could help with problems at work, and when someone had trouble with a neighbor or a business dispute that the courts couldn't resolve, certain phone calls could be made, certain favors could be requested. Sammy was a bright kid, but school held little interest for him. The nuns at his Catholic school tried to teach him about right and wrong, about following rules and respecting authority, but the lessons he learned on the street were different, more practical, more immediately applicable to the world he saw around him. He was small for his age, stocky and compact, with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. His classmates sometimes made the mistake of thinking his size made him weak, but they quickly learned otherwise. Sammy didn't just fight back when he was challenged. He fought with a ferocity that shocked adults and earned him a reputation that followed him throughout his school years. His parents worried about their son's temper, his quick resort to violence when he felt disrespected. They had immigrated to America to escape the old ways, the cycles of vendetta and violence that had plagued their homeland for centuries, but they were fighting against forces more powerful than their individual will. They were fighting against the neighborhood itself, which seemed to call to boys like Sammy with promises of respect, power, and belonging. By the time Sammy was 10 years old, he had already been in dozens of fights, not playground scuffles, but real fights where blood was drawn and reputations were made. He didn't start these fights looking for trouble, but trouble seemed to find him with remarkable consistency. A perceived slight, a disrespectful comment, a challenge to his reputation, these were all invitations to violence that Sammy never declined. His father, Gerardo, tried to channel his son's aggression into more constructive outlets. He taught him to box in the basement of their house, hoping that structured combat might satisfy the boy's need for physical confrontation. But boxing was too controlled, too rule-bound for Sammy's temperament. He preferred the chaos of street fighting, where anything could happen, and the only rule was winning. The neighborhood kids began to gather around Sammy, drawn by his reputation and his natural leadership abilities. He wasn't the biggest kid or the strongest, but he had something more valuable. He had presence. When Sammy talked, people listened. When he made a decision, people followed. When he said something was going to happen, it happened. These early leadership experiences were Sammy's first taste of power, and he found he liked it. He liked having other kids look up to him, depend on him, fear him just enough to take him seriously. He began to understand that power wasn't just about physical strength. It was about reputation, about the stories people told about you when you weren't around. The Gravano family attended Mass every Sunday at Regina Pacis Catholic Church, where young Sammy would sit in the wooden pews and listen to Father Di Giacomo preach about salvation and damnation, about choosing between good and evil. But the lessons that stuck with him weren't about divine judgment or eternal consequences. They were about loyalty, about family, about the bonds that tied people together in ways that transcended law or convention. As Sammy entered his teenage years, the distance between him and his parents began to widen. They wanted him to focus on his education, to think about college, to consider a legitimate career, that would lift him out of the neighborhood and into the mainstream American dream. But Sammy was already dreaming different dreams shaped by different role models. He had begun to notice the men who drove the expensive cars, who wore the custom, tailored suits, who commanded respect not through official titles or institutional authority, but through their own personal power. These men didn't answer to bosses or follow company policies they made. Their own rules solved their own problems and lived by a code that was older and more powerful than any law. The transformation from Salvatore the house painter's son to Sammy the Bull, Gravano, future underboss of the Gambino crime family, didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, like water slowly carving a canyon through solid rock. Each fight, each display of loyalty, each demonstration of his willingness to use violence in service of principle, carved him deeper into the shape he would eventually become. By his 16th birthday, Sammy had been suspended from school multiple times, arrested twice for fighting, and had gained a reputation that extended well beyond his immediate neighborhood. He was no longer just Gerardo's boy or Caterina's son. He was becoming someone in his own right, someone whose name carried weight on the streets of Brooklyn. The die was cast, though nobody fully understood it yet. The boy who had been born into the American dream was choosing a different path, one that led deeper into the shadows of his neighborhood, into a world where loyalty was absolute. Violence was commonplace, and the only authority that mattered was the respect you could command through your own actions. The summer of 1961 was particularly brutal in Brooklyn. The heat seemed to rise from the concrete like steam from hell, and tempers ran short in the crowded tenements and narrow streets of Bensonhurst. For 16-year-old Sammy Gravano, it was the summer he would later remember as his real education beginning, not the kind they taught in classrooms, but the kind that could only be learned with bruised knuckles and split lips. Sammy had dropped out of school that spring, much to his parents' dismay. The nuns had finally given up on him after one too many incidents, and frankly, he was relieved to be free of their rules and expectations. The streets offered a different kind of curriculum, one that seemed much more relevant to the life he was already living. His days began early, usually with a visit to Talai's restaurant on 86th Street, where the neighborhood's young toughs would gather over coffee and Italian pastries to plan their day. Talai's wasn't just a restaurant, it was an institution, a place where information was exchanged, alliances were formed, and reputations were built or destroyed with a few carefully chosen words. The owner, Salvatore Testa, everyone called him Uncle Sal, though he wasn't related to most of his customers, had a talent for making everyone feel like family while keeping his ear to the ground about everything that happened in the neighborhood. He knew which kids were headed for trouble, which ones might make something of themselves, and which ones had the potential to become real players in the life. Uncle Sal had been watching Sammy Gravano for months, and he liked what he saw. The kid had guts, no question about that. More importantly, he had brains. While other teenage tough guys relied purely on muscle and intimidation, Sammy thought strategically. He understood that every action had consequences, and he was always thinking 3 moves ahead. It was at Talai's that Sammy first met Tommy Sparrow, a kid from the neighborhood who was a few years older and had already made a name for himself as someone you didn't want to cross. Tommy was big and mean, with hands like ham hocks and a temper that could explode without warning, but he recognized something in Sammy that commanded respect, a combination of fearlessness and intelligence that was rare in their world. The two became inseparable, forming a partnership that would influence both their lives for decades to come. Tommy provided the muscle, while Sammy provided the brains. Together, they began taking on jobs that other kids wouldn't touch, collecting debts for local bookmakers, providing security for neighborhood businesses, and settling disputes that couldn't be resolved through conventional means. Their first real score came that summer when Joey Marino, who ran numbers for a crew from Bay Ridge, tried to expand his operation into Bensonhurst without showing proper respect to the local players. The established bookmakers were furious, but they needed someone to send a message without getting their own hands dirty. The job came through Uncle Sal, who called Sammy and Tommy to a private meeting in the back room of his restaurant. The room was small and windowless, filled with the smell of garlic and cigarette smoke, with a single table and 3 chairs. Uncle Sal got straight to the point. "This Marino thinks he can come into our neighborhood and set up shop without paying tribute," he said, lighting a cigarette with hands that showed the scars of his own violent youth. "The guys who've been running book here for 20 years are not happy. They need this problem to go away." Sammy understood immediately what was being asked. This wasn't about killing Joey Marino that would bring too much heat and attention. This was about sending a message that would be heard throughout Brooklyn. Bensonhurst was not open territory, and anyone who wanted to do business there had better show respect. "What kind of message are we talking about, Sammy?" asked, his voice calm and professional despite his age. Uncle Sal smiled. This was why he liked the kid. No dramatics, no tough guy posturing, just straight business. The kind that puts him in the hospital for a few weeks and convinces him that Bay Ridge is a beautiful place to do business. The payment was $500 more money than Sammy had ever seen at one time. Split between him and Tommy, it represented freedom from the part-time construction jobs and grocery store work that other kids their age relied on. More importantly, it represented acceptance into a world where real money could be made by men who were willing to take real risks. They found Joey Marino 3 days later collecting receipts from one of his numbers, runners outside a barbershop on 20th Avenue. Sammy had studied the target for 2 days, learning his routines, identifying his vulnerabilities, planning the approach that would be most effective while minimizing their exposure to risk. Tommy wanted to just walk up and beat the guy senseless, but Sammy had a more sophisticated plan. They waited until Marino was alone walking to his car after dark, carrying a paper bag that almost certainly contained the day's receipts. Sammy approached him from the front, while Tommy circled around behind. Joey Marino Sammy's voice was polite, almost friendly. When the older man turned around, Sammy hit him with a right cross that broke his nose and sent him stumbling backward into Tommy's waiting arms. What followed was swift, professional, and devastating. They didn't beat him randomly or lose control in the heat of violence. They broke specific bones, his right arm, his left leg, 3 ribs injuries that would keep him out of commission for months, while serving as a vivid reminder of what happened to people who didn't show proper respect. But the most important part came at the end, when Marino was lying on the sidewalk bleeding and broken, but still conscious. Sammy knelt down beside him and spoke in a voice that was almost gentle. "Brooklyn's a big place, Joey. Bay Ridge has got plenty of opportunities for a guy who knows how to show respect. Bensonhurst's not your neighborhood. Do we understand each other?" Marino nodded, blood streaming from his nose, understanding perfectly. The job was a masterpiece of controlled violence, and word of it spread quickly through the neighborhood's unofficial networks. Sammy Gravano, the house painter's son, had handled himself like a professional. More importantly, he had shown that he could be trusted with serious business. Over the following months, more opportunities came their way. A restaurant owner who was having trouble with protection rackets from another neighborhood. A small-time loan shark who was being muscled by competitors. A numbers runner who had decided to skim from his collections and needed to be reminded about the importance of honesty in business relationships. Each job taught Sammy something new about the world he was entering. He learned about the complex hierarchies that governed criminal enterprises, the unwritten rules that determined who could operate where, and the delicate balance of fear and respect that kept the whole system functioning. He also learned about violence, not just how to inflict it, but how to control it, how to use it as a tool rather than letting it become an end in itself. Sammy understood instinctively that random violence was the mark of an amateur. Professional violence was precise, purposeful, and always served a larger strategic objective. By the winter of 1961, Sammy's reputation had grown to the point where established players in the neighborhood were beginning to take notice. He was no longer just another tough kid looking for action. He was becoming a young man with genuine potential in the life. The transformation was visible in everything, from the way he dressed, gone were the t-shirts and jeans of his school days, replaced by pressed slacks and button-down shirts, to the way he carried himself. There was a confidence in his bearing, a sense of purpose that commanded attention and respect. His relationship with his parents became increasingly strained during this period. They could see the changes in their son, could sense that he was moving away from them and towards something they didn't understand and couldn't control. The conversations around the family dinner table grew shorter and more tense, filled with unspoken accusations and disappointed hopes. Gerardo tried one last time to reach his son, offering to help him start his own painting business, to teach him a legitimate trade that could provide a decent living. But Sammy had tasted something that no legitimate job could provide: the intoxicating combination of respect, power, and unlimited earning potential that came with life in the neighborhood's shadow economy. "This isn't what we came to America for," his father said one evening, his voice heavy with the weight of broken dreams. "We came here so our children could have better lives, legitimate lives." Sammy looked at his father with something that might have been pity. "Pop, you've been in America for 20 years, and you're still painting other people's houses? I've been in business for 6 months, and I'm making more in a week than you make in a month. Maybe you need to think about what better really means." It was a harsh thing to say to a man who had worked his entire life to provide for his family, but it reflected Sammy's growing conviction that the conventional path, education legitimate, employment gradual advancement through established institutions, was for suckers. The real money, the real power, the real respect were available to men who were willing to make their own rules and enforce them with their own strength. As 1961 drew to a close, 17-year-old Sammy Gravano had completed his basic education in the arts of intimidation, violence, and criminal enterprise. But he was still small-time, still limited to neighborhood-level operations that, while lucrative for a far teenager, were insignificant in the larger world of organized crime that controlled much of Brooklyn's illegal economy that was about to change. Word had reached certain influential people about the house painter's son, who handled himself like a professional and could be trusted to keep his mouth shut. These were people who controlled much larger operations, who thought in terms of territories rather than street corners, who measured success not in hundreds of dollars, but in hundreds of thousands. They were about to offer Sammy Gravano an opportunity that would change his life forever, a chance to join a real crew, to learn from men who had made fortunes in the shadow world of organized crime, and to begin his ascent through the ranks of what would eventually become known as America's most powerful crime family. The boy was about to become a man, and the man was about to become a monster. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in February 1962, while Sammy was having breakfast at Tylai's restaurant. Uncle Sal approached his table with an expression that Sammy had learned to recognize, the look of a man who had important business to discuss. "Finish your coffee and come to the back," Uncle Sal said quietly. "There's someone who wants to meet you." In the back room, a man Sammy had never seen before sat smoking a cigarette and reading the daily news. He was in his 40s, well-dressed in the understated way that marked him as someone of importance in the neighborhood hierarchy. When he looked up at Sammy, his eyes were the color of winter ice, and they seemed to take in everything about him in a single glance. "You're Gerardo's boy," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. I'm Toto Arello." He didn't need to say anything else. Everyone in Bensonhurst knew who Toto Arello was, a capo in the Gambino family, a man who controlled a significant piece of Brooklyn's illegal economy, someone whose approval could make careers and whose displeasure could end them. Uncle Sal quietly excused himself, leaving Sammy alone with one of the most powerful men he had ever met. Tato stubbed out his cigarette and studied the 17-year-old for a long moment before speaking. "I've been hearing things about you," he said finally. "Good things. You handle yourself like a professional. You keep your mouth shut, and you understand that business is business. These are valuable qualities." Sammy waited, understanding instinctively that this was not a conversation where he should volunteer information or try to impress anyone. Men like Tato didn't need to be impressed. They needed to be respected and listened to. "I'm putting together a crew," Tato continued. "Young guys with potential, guys who can learn the right way to do things. There's money to be made, real money, but it requires discipline and absolute loyalty. You interested?" It was the opportunity Sammy had been unconsciously preparing for his entire life. Everything that had happened up to this point, the fights, the jobs, the gradual building of his reputation, had led to this moment. He was being offered entry into the real world of organized crime, not as a street-level tough guy, but as a potential member of an established crew with connections throughout the criminal underworld. "Yes, sir, I'm very interested." Tato nodded approvingly. "Good. But first, you need to understand what you're getting into. This isn't kid stuff anymore. The men you'll be working with have killed people. Some of them have been to prison. All of them have sworn an oath that's more sacred than marriage, more binding than any legal contract. Once you're in for life. There's no retirement, no resignation, no walking away when things get tough." He paused to light another cigarette, letting the weight of his words sink in. "The rewards are significant. More money than you've ever imagined, respect throughout the neighborhood, protection from your enemies, and the knowledge that you're part of something larger than yourself. But the price is high. Everything you do reflects on the family. Every mistake you make becomes everyone's problem. And if you ever betray the trust that's being placed in you, the consequences will be permanent." Sammy understood he was being offered membership in what was essentially a secret society, one with its own rules, its own system of justice, and its own code of ethics that existed, parallel to, sometimes in direct conflict with, the laws of conventional society. "I understand," he said simply. "We'll see. Your first job is tonight. There's a problem that needs to be resolved, and I want to see how you handle yourself when things get serious." That evening, Sammy found himself in a car with 3 other men driving through the dark streets of Queens toward a warehouse district he had never seen before. The other men, Louis, Melito, Joe Peruda, and Stymie D'Angelo, were all seasoned members of Tato's crew, and they treated Sammy with the casual indifference reserved for new guys who hadn't yet proven themselves. The target was a man named Vincent Bisaccia, who had been skimming from his numbers operation and lying about his collections to Tato's people. Worse, when confronted about the discrepancies, he had responded with disrespect, suggesting that maybe it was time for him to take his business elsewhere. In the world Sammy was entering, such behavior couldn't be tolerated. It wasn't just about the money, though the missing funds were significant. It was about respect, about maintaining the discipline that kept the entire criminal ecosystem functioning. If word got out that someone could steal from Tato Arello and walk away unpunished, it would encourage others to try the same thing. They found Bisaccia at a social club in Astoria, playing cards with friends who scattered like roaches when Tato's crew walked through the door. Bisaccia himself tried to act casual, as if this were just a routine visit from business associates. "Tato's boys," he said with forced joviality. "What brings you to my neighborhood?" Louis Melito, who seemed to be in charge of the operation, got straight to the point. "You know why we're here, Vinny. You've got something that belongs to Mr. Arello." "I don't know what you're talking about." $43,000. "That's what you're short over the last 6 months. You think we don't keep books." Bisaccia's face went pale, but he tried to bluster his way through. There must be some mistake. I've been running clean operations, never skimmed a dime. It was the wrong answer. Sammy watched as Louis's expression hardened as Joe Peruta moved to block the exit as the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. This was the moment when civilized conversation ended and serious business began. Here's what's going to happen. Louis said, his voice calm and conversational. You're going to come with us for a ride. We're going to have a more detailed conversation about your bookkeeping practices, and you're going to help us understand exactly where that missing money went. Bisaccia looked around the room, perhaps hoping for support from his friends, but the place had emptied out completely. In situations like this, smart people made themselves scarce. He was on his own. I'm not going anywhere with you guys, he said, trying to sound defiant, but unable to keep the fear out of his voice. That's when Sammy got his first lesson in how Tato's crew handled resistance. Louis nodded almost imperceptibly to stymie D'Angelo, who stepped forward and hit Bisaccia with a short, vicious uppercut that lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into a table of empty beer bottles. The sound of breaking glass seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence. Bisaccia lay among the shards, blood streaming from his nose, looking up at men whose expressions hadn't changed at all. The violence had been swift, professional, and utterly matter-of-fact. Now Louis said pleasantly, let's try that again. You're going to come with us for a ride. They drove to an abandoned warehouse in an industrial section of Queens, a place where screams wouldn't be heard and where cleanup would be simple. Sammy's heart was pounding, but he kept his expression, neutral, understanding that he was being tested as much as Bisaccia was being punished. Inside the warehouse, they tied Bisaccia to a chair and began the kind of conversation that had been taking place in similar locations throughout Brooklyn for decades. It started with questions about the missing money, about where it had gone, about why Bisaccia thought he could steal from people who trusted him. When Bisaccia continued to deny any wrongdoing, the conversation became more physical. Joe Peruta, who looked like someone's grandfather, proved to be an artist with a baseball bat, breaking bones with surgical precision, while never allowing his victim to lose consciousness. Through it all, Sammy watched and learned. This wasn't random violence or sadistic entertainment. This was business conducted with the same professional detachment that a surgeon might bring to an operation. Every blow served a purpose, every question was part of a larger strategy to extract information and establish consequences for betrayal. After 2 hours, Bisaccia finally broke. The money had gone to support a gambling habit that had spiraled out of control. He had been betting on everything horses, sports card games, and losing consistently. Rather than admit his problem to his superiors, he had chosen to steal from collections, thinking he could replace the money before anyone noticed. It was a story they had all heard before, a familiar tale of weakness, leading to betrayal, leading to consequences that could never be undone. Where's the money now? Louis asked. Gone, Bisaccia sobbed. All of it. I owe bookmakers in 3 states. Even if I had it, I couldn't pay you back. Louis looked at his associates, and Sammy saw something pass between them, a silent communication that he didn't yet understand, but knew was significant. Here's the thing, Vinny, Louis said, pulling up a chair, so he was sitting directly in front of the broken man. You didn't just steal from us. You lied to us, you disrespected us, and now you're telling us that you can't make it right. That presents us with a problem. Sammy realized with a chill that ran down his spine that Vincent Bisaccia was not going home that night. This had moved beyond punishment into something much more final. Please, Bisaccia whispered. I got kids. I got a family. You should have thought about that before you decided to become a thief, Stymie said coldly. What happened next would stay with Sammy for the rest of his life. He watched as 3 men he was learning to respect and admire methodically ended another human being's life, not in passion or anger, but as a simple business decision. Vincent Bisaccia had become a liability that could no longer be tolerated, and he was being eliminated with the same efficiency that might be used to close down an unprofitable business venture. Louis was the one who actually pulled the trigger, using a .38 revolver that he had carried in his coat pocket throughout the evening. 2 shots to the head, quick and clean, and Vincent Bisaccia's gambling problem was permanently resolved. In the silence that followed, Sammy felt as though he had crossed some invisible line, passed through some barrier that separated the world. He had known from the world he was entering. He had witnessed his first murder, and while he hadn't participated directly, he understood that his presence made him complicit, bound him to the men around him in ways that could never be undone. "How you feeling, kid?" Joe Peruta asked him as they wrapped Bisaccia's body in plastic sheeting. "Fine," Sammy replied, and realized that he meant it. The violence had been shocking, but not traumatic. The death had been necessary, and he understood why it had been necessary. Vincent Bisaccia had made choices that led inevitably to this moment, and now he was facing the consequences of those choices. They disposed of the body in a location that Sammy was never told about, following procedures that had obviously been refined through years of experience. By dawn, there was no trace of Vincent Bisaccia, except for the missing person report that his family would file later that week. As they drove back to Brooklyn, Louis turned to Sammy with something that might have been approval in his expression. "You did good tonight, kid. Kept your mouth shut, didn't ask stupid questions, didn't lose your nerve when things got serious. That's exactly what we're looking for." It was Sammy's first real compliment from an established member of Tato's crew, and it meant more to him than any praise he had ever received from teachers' parents or conventional authority figures. These men had accepted him, had brought him into their world, had trusted him with their darkest secrets. In return, he would give them his absolute loyalty, his complete discretion, and his unwavering commitment to the principles that governed their shared existence. He would become one of them, learn their methods, adopt their values, and eventually surpass most of them in his understanding of how power really worked in their shadow world. The education of Sammy Gravano was entering its advanced phase, and he was proving to be an exceptional student. By the summer of 1963, Sammy Gravano had become a fixture in Tato. Aurello's crew, no longer the untested kid who had to prove himself with every job, but a trusted associate whose opinion was sought and whose judgment was respected. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. He carried himself differently, spoke with more authority, and commanded the kind of respect that could only be earned through demonstrated competence and unwavering loyalty. Tato's crew operated out of a social club on 20th Avenue, a nondescript storefront with blacked-out windows and a door that was always locked to outsiders. Inside the club was furnished with the kind of understated elegance that marked it as a place where serious men discussed serious business. Leather chairs arranged around card tables, a well-stocked bar, and walls decorated with photographs of neighborhood legends who had earned their place in local history through their contributions to the life. The club served multiple functions. During the day, it was a meeting place where crew members would gather to receive instructions, report on their activities, and coordinate their various enterprises. In the evening, it became a social center where established players in the neighborhood hierarchy could relax, enjoy each other's company, and conduct the kind of informal diplomacy that kept the peace between competing factions. For Sammy, the club was like a university where he studied subjects that weren't taught in any conventional classroom. He learned about the complex economics of illegal gambling, the delicate art of loan sharking, the logistics of stolen goods, distribution, and the psychology of intimidation. More importantly, he learned about respect, how to earn it, how to maintain it, and how to use it as both weapon and shield in a world where reputation was often the difference between prosperity and disaster. Tato Aurello was a natural teacher, though his methods were far removed from conventional pedagogy. He never lectured or explained theories. Instead, he demonstrated principles through practical application, allowing his students to observe, participate, and gradually absorb the wisdom that came from decades of successful criminal enterprise. The key to this business, Toto told Sammy, one afternoon as they sat in the club's back room reviewing the week's receipts, is understanding that we're not criminals. We're businessmen who operate outside the law because the law doesn't serve our community's needs. It was a distinction that would shape Sammy's thinking for the rest of his career. In Toto's worldview, they weren't breaking society's rules. They were following older, more fundamental rules that predated governments and police departments. They were providing services that people wanted but couldn't obtain through legitimate channels. They were enforcing contracts that the courts wouldn't recognize. They were maintaining order in situations where conventional authority was either absent or ineffective. The crew's primary business was gambling numbers, running sports betting and card games that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in pure profit. But Toto taught Sammy that successful criminal enterprises were like successful legitimate businesses. They diversified their revenue streams, reinvested their profits, and constantly looked for new opportunities to expand their market share. Loan sharking was a natural complement to gambling, since players who lost more than they could afford to pay often needed emergency financing to cover their debts or continue playing. Toto's crew offered loans at interest rates that would have been considered criminal in any legitimate context, but their collection methods ensured that defaults were rare and payment schedules were rigorously maintained. The crew also had interests in several legitimate businesses, a construction company, a trucking firm, and a chain of restaurants that provided both cover for their illegal activities and opportunities for money laundering. Sammy learned how clean money and dirty money could be blended together until their origins became impossible to trace, how legitimate businesses could be used to justify lavish lifestyles, and how the appearance of respectability could provide protection from law enforcement attention. But the most important lesson Toto taught him was about violence, not just how to use it, but when to use it, how much to use, and most crucially, when not to use it at all. Violence is like medicine, Toto explained after a particularly brutal debt collection that had left a deadbeat, better hospitalized with broken ribs and a punctured lung. The right dose at the right time can cure a problem. Too little, and the problem persists too much, and you create bigger problems than the one you started with. Sammy absorbed this wisdom through direct observation and hands-on experience. He learned that the threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself, that a reputation for ruthlessness could accomplish what actual brutality might not, and that the most successful criminals were those who used force strategically rather than randomly. One of his most educational experiences came in the spring of 1964 when a rival crew from Staten Island began trying to muscle in on Toto's numbers operation in Bath Beach. The situation required delicate handling. Too aggressive a response might start a war that would bring unwanted attention from both law enforcement and higher levels of this Gambino family hierarchy, but too weak a response would signal that Toto's territory was vulnerable to further encroachment. Toto assigned Sammy to lead a small team in demonstrating to the Staten Island crew that their expansion plans were not welcome. It was a significant responsibility, a kind of leadership opportunity that could either enhance Sammy's reputation within the organization or damage it permanently if he handled it poorly. Sammy spent 2 weeks studying the situation, learning about the individuals involved, their strengths and vulnerabilities, their connections within the broader criminal community, and their likely responses to various forms of pressure. He approached the problem like a chess master, thinking several moves ahead and preparing contingencies for every possible scenario. The Staten Island crew was led by a man named Anthony Gaggi, who had a reputation for unpredictable violence and very little patience for negotiation. Gaggi's approach to territorial disputes was straightforward. kill anyone who got in his way, and let fear maintain his boundaries. It was an effective strategy in the short term, but it created enemies and attracted attention that eventually led to problems. Rather than confronting Gaggi directly, Sammy chose to target his operation's weakest point, a network of street-level collectors who actually handled the day-to-day interactions with bettors. These were neighborhood guys who worked for Gaggi, not out of loyalty or fear, but simply because he paid them better than their other options. Sammy offered several of Gaggi's collectors significantly better terms to switch their allegiance to Tato's. Operation higher commissions, better protection, and the security. That came with working for an established crew with deep roots in the community. Within a week, half of Gaggi's collection network had defected, taking their customer lists with them. When Gaggi responded by sending enforcers to intimidate the defectors, Sammy was ready. The enforcers found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and facing opponents who knew the neighborhood terrain better than they did. 2 of Gaggi's men ended up in the hospital, and the third one carried back a message. It was both clear and courteous. Bath Beach was not available for expansion, but Tato's crew was always interested in discussing mutually beneficial business arrangements. The message was received and understood. Gaggi withdrew his people from Brooklyn and focused his attention on less well-defended territories. The crisis was resolved without bloodshed, without attracting law enforcement attention, and without creating the kind of vendetta that could have led to years of violence. Tato was impressed. "You handled that perfectly," he told Sammy after the situation was resolved. "You understood that the goal wasn't to hurt anybody or prove how tough we are. The goal was to protect our business interests while maintaining the peace. That's the mark of a man who's ready for bigger responsibilities." Those bigger responsibilities came sooner than Sammy had expected. In the fall of 1964, Tato informed him that he was being considered for formal membership in the Gambino family, not just as an associate or crew member, but as a made man, with all the rights, privileges, and obligations that such status entailed. The prospect was both thrilling and sobering. Made membership in a crime family was the ultimate recognition. In their world, an acknowledgement that the individual possessed the intelligence, loyalty, and demonstrated competence to be trusted with the organization's most sensitive secrets. But it was also a lifetime commitment that could never be revoked or abandoned. "This isn't something you accept lightly," Tato warned him. "Once you take the oath, there's no going back. Your loyalty to the family becomes absolute more important than your loyalty to your wife, your children, or your own life. You'll be expected to kill for the family if necessary, and to die for it if required." Sammy didn't need time to consider his answer. Everything in his life had been leading to this moment. Every fight, every job, every demonstration of loyalty and competence had been preparation for the opportunity to join the most exclusive and powerful criminal organization in America. "I'm ready," he said simply. The formal initiation ceremony took place on a cold December night in 1964 in the basement of a funeral home that had been serving the neighborhood's Italian families for 3 generations. The setting was appropriate. This was a kind of death and rebirth, the end of Salvatore Gravano the individual, and the beginning of Sammy Gravano, the made man. The ceremony itself was ancient, unchanged for centuries, steeped in ritual and symbolism that connected the new initiate to generations of men who had taken the same oath under similar circumstances. Sammy knelt before a table bearing the image of a saint, held a burning piece of paper in his cupped hands, and recited the words that would define the rest of his life. "I enter into this organization to protect my family and to protect all my friends. I swear not to divulge this secret and to obey with love and omerta. I enter alive into this organization and leave it only in death." As the paper burned in his hands, Sammy felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. He was now part of something larger than himself, connected to a tradition that stretched back to the hills of Ah. Sicily, and forward to an uncertain but potentially glorious future. The men who witnessed his initiation, Tado Arello, several other capos in the family's underboss, welcomed him with embraces and congratulations, but their expressions were serious, almost solemn. They understood the magnitude of what had just occurred, the irrevocable step that had been taken. At 19 years old, Sammy Gravano had achieved what many men in their world spent their entire careers pursuing. He was a made member of the Gambino family, entitled to respect. Throughout the criminal community, protected by the most powerful organization in American organized crime, in position to rise as high as his abilities and ambitions would take him. The education phase of his criminal career was complete. The real work was about to begin. The mid-1960s were a golden age for organized crime in New York and Sammy Gravano found himself perfectly positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that prosperity and social change were creating. As a newly made member of the Gambino family, he had access to resources, connections, and protection that allowed him to think beyond the street-level activities that had occupied his teenage years. His first major independent venture was a construction company that he established in partnership with several other young members of Tado's crew. On the surface, Gravano Construction was a legitimate business that bid on municipal contracts, built residential developments, and provided renovation services to commercial clients throughout Brooklyn. But beneath this respectable facade, it served as both a money laundering operation and a platform for the kind of sophisticated criminal enterprises that were becoming increasingly common in New York's construction industry. The construction business in New York had always been fertile ground for organized crime involvement. The industry was heavily unionized, relied on complex networks of subcontractors and suppliers, and operated under regulations that could be manipulated by men who understood how to work the system. More importantly, it generated enormous amounts of cash that could be easily diverted, disguised, or otherwise manipulated to serve criminal purposes. Sammy's approach to the construction business reflected the lessons he had learned from Tado Arello about the importance of appearing legitimate while maintaining criminal profit margins. Gravano Construction submitted competitive bids on real projects, employed skilled workers, and delivered quality results that satisfied their legitimate customers. But they also skimmed cash from project budgets, sold materials to other criminal enterprises at inflated prices, and used their legitimate contracts as cover for a variety of illegal activities. The key to their success was Sammy's understanding that modern criminal enterprises needed to be more sophisticated than the crude protection rackets and street-level gambling operations that had sustained earlier generations of organized crime figures. The economy was changing, becoming more complex and interconnected and smart. Criminals needed to evolve with it or risk being left behind. One of Sammy's most profitable innovations was his involvement in the concrete industry, which was experiencing explosive growth. As New York underwent massive urban development projects throughout the 1960s, concrete was essential to virtually every major construction project in the city, and the companies that supplied it operated in a relatively closed market that was vulnerable to the kind of manipulation that organized crime had perfected in other industries. Working with other Gambino family members, Sammy helped establish what amounted to a cartel that controlled concrete prices throughout much of Brooklyn and Queens. Construction companies that wanted reliable supplies of concrete at reasonable prices needed to work with approved suppliers, pay agreed upon prices, and follow labor practices that were dictated by union representatives who happened to have close relationships with various crime families. The system was elegant in its simplicity and enormously profitable for everyone involved except the ultimate consumers, property developers, and municipal agencies who found themselves paying inflated prices for concrete. while having little choice in suppliers. But the markup was usually small enough to be absorbed into overall project costs, and the reliability of supply more than compensated for the slightly higher prices. More importantly, from Sammy's perspective, the concrete business provided him with legitimate income that could be used to justify his increasingly expensive lifestyle, while also generating enormous amounts of untraceable cash that could be invested in other criminal ventures. By 1967, Sammy was earning more money than most legitimate businessmen, driving expensive cars, wearing custom tailored suits, and living in a style that would have been impossible on any conventional salary. But he was careful to maintain the appearance of modesty, understanding that ostentatious displays of wealth could attract unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies that were beginning to take a more active interest in organized crime activities. His personal life during this period was complicated by the demands of his criminal career. He had married his teenage girlfriend, Deborah Sabetta, in a traditional Italian ceremony that brought together hundreds of guests from throughout the Brooklyn criminal community. The wedding was both a personal milestone and a business networking opportunity, allowing Sammy to strengthen relationships with other crime family members while demonstrating his commitment to the traditional values that governed their shared world. Deborah understood the nature of her husband's work, though they rarely discussed specific details. She had grown up in the same neighborhood, attended the same schools, and absorbed the same lessons about loyalty, respect, and the importance of keeping family business private. She knew that her role was to maintain their home as a sanctuary where Sammy could relax and recover from the stresses of his professional life, and she fulfilled that role with the same dedication that he brought to his criminal enterprises. Their first child, Gerard, was born in 1968, followed 2 years later by their daughter, Corinne. Fatherhood brought new dimensions to Sammy's life, but it also created new pressures. He wanted to provide his children with every advantage, every opportunity, every protection that his growing wealth and influence could secure, but he also worried about the kind of world he was creating for them, the legacy he would leave behind, and the possibility that his criminal activities might someday threaten their safety or happiness. These concerns led him to begin thinking more strategically about his long-term future. While he remained completely committed to his life in organized crime, he began to consider how he might position himself to benefit from changing conditions in both the criminal underworld and the legitimate economy. One of the most significant changes was occurring within the Gambino family itself. Carlo Gambino, who had led the organization since the 1950s, was aging and beginning to think about succession. The family was growing larger and more complex, with interests that extended far beyond the traditional neighborhood-based operations that had sustained earlier generations. The new criminal economy required different skills, different approaches, and different types of leadership. Sammy recognized that his generation of crime family members had advantages that their predecessors had lacked. They were better educated, more sophisticated in their understanding of modern business practices, and more comfortable operating in the legitimate world when circumstances required it. But they also faced challenges that earlier generations had never encountered: more aggressive law enforcement, more sophisticated surveillance techniques, and a changing social environment that was less tolerant of the kind of violence that had once been accepted as a normal part of neighborhood life. His response was to begin building what amounted to a criminal conglomerate that could operate effectively in multiple environments simultaneously. Gravano Construction continued to grow, taking on larger projects and developing relationships with major developers throughout the New York area. But Sammy also invested in restaurants, trucking companies, waste management firms, and other businesses that could provide both legitimate income and cover for criminal activities. The key to managing these diverse interests was delegation and compartmentalization. Sammy surrounded himself with trusted associates who could handle day-to-day operations, while he focused on strategic planning and relationship management. He learned to think like a corporate executive, understanding that successful criminal enterprises required the same kind of professional management that characterized successful legitimate businesses. But he never lost sight of the fundamental principles that governed his world. Respect remained the most important currency. Loyalty was still the highest virtue, and violence, while used more sparingly than in earlier eras, remained the ultimate tool for resolving disputes that couldn't be settled through negotiation or intimidation. An incident from this period illustrates how Sammy had learned to balance these competing demands. In 1969, a legitimate contractor named Robert Bisaccia began undercutting Gravano Construction's bids on several municipal projects by using non-union labor and substandard materials. Bisaccia was not connected to organized crime, had no understanding of the unwritten rules that governed the construction industry in Brooklyn, and apparently believed that competitive pricing and political connections would be sufficient to protect his business interests. An earlier generation of criminals might have resolved the problem by burning down Bisaccia's equipment or breaking his legs. But Sammy chose a more sophisticated approach that reflected both his growing business acumen and his understanding of how to operate in a changing environment. Rather than attacking Bisaccia directly, Sammy arranged for him to encounter a series of problems that made his low-bid strategy unsustainable. His supply deliveries began arriving late or not at all. His equipment suffered mysterious mechanical failures that required expensive repairs. His workers faced harassment and intimidation that led many of them to quit and find employment elsewhere. Most importantly, Sammy used his connections within the municipal bureaucracy to ensure that Bisaccia's projects faced unusually rigorous inspections that revealed numerous code violations and safety hazards. The resulting delays and required corrections eliminated any cost advantages that Bisaccia's low bids had provided, while establishing a pattern of problems that made him an unattractive contractor for future projects. Within 6 months, Bisaccia's business was failing. He approached Sammy through intermediaries to discuss the possibility of resolving their competition through some form of cooperation. The meeting took place in a restaurant that Sammy partially owned on neutral ground, where both men could speak freely without fear of immediate violence. "I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot," Bisaccia said, clearly hoping to find some face-saving way to withdraw from competitive bidding against Gravano Construction. Sammy was gracious in victory. "Business is business," he replied. "There's room for everybody in this industry, as long as everybody understands the rules and shows proper respect." They worked out an arrangement that allowed Bisaccia to continue operating while steering clear of projects that Gravano Construction considered to be within its sphere of influence. It was a solution that avoided bloodshed, minimized law enforcement attention, and established precedents that would discourage other potential competitors from making similar mistakes. By the end of the 1960s, Sammy Gravano had established himself as one of the most successful and respected young members of the Gambino family. His criminal enterprises were generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. His legitimate businesses provided both cover and additional income, and his reputation for intelligence and discretion had brought him to the attention of the family's senior leadership. But the world around him was changing in ways that would challenge everything he had learned about how organized crime operated in America. The 1970s would bring new laws, new enforcement techniques, and new social pressures that would force him to evolve or risk becoming extinct. The skills that had served him well in the neighborhood-based criminal economy of the 1960s would need to be adapted to a more complex and dangerous environment where the stakes were higher and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. The building phase of Sammy Gravano's criminal career was coming to an end. The survival phase was about to begin. The death of Carlo Gambino in October 1976 marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter. In both the history of America's most powerful crime family and Sammy Gravano's ascent through its ranks, Gambino had ruled for more than 2 decades, building his organization into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with interests throughout New York and beyond. His death created a succession crisis that would reshape the family's structure and ultimately provide ambitious men like Sammy with unprecedented opportunities for advancement. The succession went to Paul Castellano Gambino's brother-in-law and longtime underboss, though not without controversy. Many family members had expected the leadership to pass to Aniello Delacroce, a more traditional mob figure who commanded greater respect among the street level soldiers and capos who formed the organization's operational backbone. Delacroce was passed over ostensibly because of his age and health problems, but many believed the decision reflected Castellano's superior political skills and family connections rather than his qualifications as a leader. Castellano represented a new breed of crime family boss, more businessman than street fighter, more interested in sophisticated white-collar crimes than traditional neighborhood rackets. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island rather than a modest home in Brooklyn, wore expensive suits tailored by the same designers who dressed legitimate business executives and preferred boardroom negotiations to back alley violence. For Sammy Gravano, Castellano's ascension represented both opportunity and challenge. The new boss was looking for subordinates who could operate effectively in the legitimate business world while maintaining the discipline and loyalty that had always characterized successful crime family members. Sammy's combination of street credibility and business acumen made him exactly the kind of person Castellano needed to implement his vision of a more sophisticated, more profitable criminal organization. The opportunity came in 1978 when Castellano decided to reorganize the family's construction interests into a more centralized and efficient operation. The construction industry had always been important to the Gambinos, but Castellano envisioned something much more ambitious, a coordinated effort to control major aspects of the industry throughout the New York metropolitan area. Sammy was selected to lead this initiative, a responsibility that effectively made him one of the most powerful figures in the family, despite his relatively young age. The appointment reflected both Castellano's confidence in his abilities and the boss's understanding that the construction industry required someone who could function equally well in legitimate business settings and traditional criminal environments. The centerpiece of the new organization was something called the Concrete Club, though that name was never used in official communications or formal meetings. The club was essentially a cartel that brought together representatives from the major crime families to coordinate their involvement in the concrete supply industry. By working together rather than competing against each other, the families could control prices, divide territories, and ensure that all major construction projects in New York paid tribute to organized crime in one form or another. Sammy's role in the Concrete Club was both operational and diplomatic. He helped establish the pricing structures that member companies would follow, mediated disputes between different families over territorial boundaries, and served as the primary liaison between the criminal organizations and the legitimate businesses that depended on their concrete supplies. The system worked with remarkable efficiency. Construction companies that wanted reliable concrete supplies at predictable prices could work with club-approved suppliers and faced no interference with their projects. Companies that tried to circumvent the system by working with independent suppliers often found themselves facing labor disputes, material shortages, and regulatory problems that made their projects unprofitable or impossible to complete. The markup imposed by the Concrete Club was usually modest, typically 5 to 10%. above what truly competitive pricing would have been. But when applied to the billions of dollars worth of construction projects undertaken in New York during the late 1970s and early 1980s, even small percentage increases generated enormous profits for the participating crime families. Sammy's personal share of these profits was substantial, but more important was the respect and influence that came with managing such a complex and sensitive operation. He was no longer just another successful criminal entrepreneur. He was now a figure of national importance within organized crime, someone whose decisions affected the economic interests of multiple crime families, and whose judgment was trusted by some of the most powerful criminals in America. The success of the Concrete Club led to similar initiatives in other industries. Sammy became involved in coordinating organized crime's involvement in waste management, trucking, and restaurant supply businesses. Each industry presented unique challenges and opportunities, but the basic model remained the same: use criminal influence to create controlled markets that generated consistent profits for participating organizations while appearing legitimate to outside observers. Perhaps the most ambitious of these ventures was the waste management cartel that emerged in the early 1980s. The waste disposal industry in New York was fragmented among dozens of small companies that competed aggressively for commercial and municipal contracts. Most of these companies operated with thin profit margins and were vulnerable to the kind of market manipulation that organized crime had perfected in other industries. Working with representatives from other crime families, Sammy helped establish a system that divided the metropolitan area into exclusive territories, with each participating company guaranteed a monopoly within their assigned region. Customers who wanted reliable waste disposal services at reasonable prices could work with the assigned company for their area and face no problems. Customers who tried to switch to cheaper competitors often found that their new waste disposal company experienced mysterious problems that made reliable service impossible. The waste management cartel was even more profitable than the Concrete Club because it involved ongoing service contracts rather than one-time construction projects. Once a customer was assigned to a particular waste disposal company, they typically remained with that company for years, generating steady revenue streams that could be predicted and managed like any other business investment. But the most significant development during Sammy's rise to prominence within the Castellano organization was his growing relationship with John Gotti, a capo from the family's Queens faction, who shared Sammy's combination of street credibility and business ambition. Gotti was everything that Paul Castellano was not: flamboyant where Castellano was, reserved, impulsive where Castellano was, calculating, beloved by street-level criminals where Castellano was, respected but not particularly liked. Their first significant collaboration came in 1980 when a dispute arose between the Gambino family and a crew from the Lucchese family over control of gambling operations at Kennedy Airport. The dispute had the potential to escalate into the kind of violent conflict that would attract law enforcement attention and disrupt profitable business relationships throughout the criminal community. Castellano assigned Sammy and Gotti to work together to resolve the situation, recognizing that their different skills and approaches might complement each other effectively. It was the beginning of a partnership that would define both their careers and ultimately reshape the Gambino family's leadership structure. Gotti's approach to the airport dispute was characteristically direct. He wanted to demonstrate superior firepower, intimidate the Lucchese crew into withdrawal, and establish the Gambino's dominance through a show of force that would discourage future challenges. Sammy preferred a more subtle strategy that would resolve the immediate problem, while avoiding the violence and attention that might create larger problems. Their solution was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than confronting the Lucchese crew directly, They arranged for several of their key operatives to be arrested on unrelated charges that removed them from active duty without creating martyrs or triggering retaliation. Meanwhile, they negotiated a face-saving agreement with the Lucchese family leadership that allowed both organizations to claim victory while dividing the airports, gambling proceeds in a way that satisfied everyone's economic interests. The success of this collaboration established a pattern that would characterize Sammy and Gotti's relationship for the next several years. Gotti provided the charisma and street credibility that inspired loyalty among the family's soldiers and associates. Sammy provided the strategic thinking and business expertise that turned violent impulses into profitable enterprises. But their partnership also highlighted growing tensions within the Gambino family, between the old guard, represented by Paul Castellano, and the new generation, represented by figures like Gotti and Gravano. Castellano's emphasis on sophisticated white-collar crimes and legitimate business ventures was profitable, but it distanced him from the street-level activities that had traditionally been the foundation of crime family power. Many of the family's soldiers and capos felt that Castellano had lost touch with the realities of criminal life at his mansion on Staten Island, and his preference for business meetings over neighborhood gatherings reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what made organized crime effective. They respected his intelligence and his ability to generate profits, but they questioned his commitment to the values and traditions that had sustained their organization through previous challenges. These tensions came to a head in 1985 when federal prosecutors in Manhattan announced a massive racketeering case against the leadership of several New York crime families. The case, which became known as the Commission Trial, charged Paul Castellano and other top organized crime figures with operating a criminal enterprise that had systematically corrupted major sectors of the New York economy. The indictment was based on years of surveillance, wiretapped conversations, and testimony from informants who had provided law enforcement with unprecedented insight into how organized crime actually operated. For the first time in American history, federal prosecutors felt confident that they could prove in court that the Mafia was a real organization with formal structures, established procedures, and documented criminal activities. Castellano's reaction to the indictment was characteristically businesslike. He hired expensive lawyers, began preparing a defense strategy, and continued to conduct family business as if the legal proceedings were just another operational challenge that could be managed through proper planning and resource allocation. But other family members were less optimistic about their boss's prospects. The evidence against Castellano appeared overwhelming, and conviction would almost certainly result in a life sentence that would effectively end his leadership of the organization. More troubling was the possibility that Castellano might decide to cooperate with prosecutors to reduce his sentence, betraying the organization's secrets in exchange for personal consideration. John Gotti began to argue privately that the family needed new leadership, someone who understood that the old ways of doing business were no longer sufficient in an environment where law enforcement had become more sophisticated and more aggressive. He believed that Castellano's arrest provided an opportunity to install a boss who would return the family to its roots while adapting to new realities. Sammy found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position between his official loyalty to Paul Castellano and his growing conviction that Gotti's analysis was correct. The legal system had changed the rules of the game, and successful adaptation would require different leadership, different strategies, and different priorities than had worked in earlier eras. The decision about what to do would ultimately determine not just the future of the Gambino family, but also Sammy Gravano's place within the organization and his prospects for long-term survival in an increasingly dangerous world. The comfortable certainties of the Castellano years were coming to an end, and what would replace them was far from clear. December 16, 1985, was a cold, Monday evening in Manhattan, with early winter darkness settling over the streets as rush hour traffic began to thin. At Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, reservations had been made for a dinner meeting that was supposed to resolve some pressing family business. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family, was scheduled to meet with several of his capos to discuss strategy for the upcoming commission trial and other matters requiring his attention. What Castellano didn't know was that this dinner meeting was a trap carefully orchestrated by John Gotti and a small group of conspirators who had decided that the family's survival required new leadership. Among those conspirators was Sammy Gravano, who had wrestled with his conscience for months before concluding that his loyalty to the organization outweighed his personal obligations to Paul Castellano. The decision to eliminate Castellano had not been made lightly or quickly. It represented the culmination of years of growing dissatisfaction with his leadership style, strategic decisions, and apparent disconnect from the realities facing the family's street-level operations. But the immediate catalyst was Castellano's legal troubles and the very real possibility that he might cooperate with federal prosecutors to avoid spending the rest of his life in prison. Gotti had been building support for his position throughout 1985, carefully sounding out other family members about their concerns regarding Castellano's leadership. The conversations were necessarily oblique, since directly advocating the assassination of a sitting boss was an extremely dangerous position to take if word got back to the wrong people. But gradually Gotti had assembled a group of supporters who shared his belief that dramatic action was necessary. Sammy's recruitment to the conspiracy was a crucial development, both because of his reputation for strategic thinking and because of his close relationships with other powerful figures within the family. When Gotti approached him about the possibility of making a change, Sammy understood immediately what was being proposed and what would be expected of him if he agreed to participate. "This isn't about personal ambition," Gotti explained during a carefully private conversation in November 1985. "This is about survival. Paul's lost touch with what this family is supposed to be about. He's more interested in his construction deals and his legitimate businesses than he is in protecting the soldiers who do the real work. And now with these federal cases coming down, he's talking about plea bargains and cooperation agreements like he's some kind of white-collar criminal instead of a man of honor." Sammy had heard similar complaints from other family members, and he shared many of their concerns. Castellano's emphasis on sophisticated criminal enterprises had been profitable, but it had also created distance between the leadership and the organization's traditional base of support. Moreover, the legal pressures facing the family required leadership that understood both the streets and the courtrooms, someone who could maintain discipline while adapting to new realities. "What you're talking about," Sammy said carefully, "is something that can't be undone. Once we cross that line, there's no going back. We better be absolutely certain that it's necessary and that we can pull it off without destroying the family in the process." Gotti nodded gravely. "I've thought about nothing else for months. Paul's finished whether we act or not. The feds have him dead to rights and he knows it. The question is whether we let him take the family down with him or whether we do what needs to be done to protect the organization." The planning for what would become known as the hit of the century took weeks of careful preparation. Every detail had to be considered, every contingency planned, for every potential witness or complication accounted for. This wasn't a typical organized crime assassination that could be carried out in some isolated location with minimal risk of detection. This was the public execution of one of the most powerful crime bosses in America, conducted in the heart of Manhattan during evening rush hour. The team assembled for the operation reflected both the magnitude of the target and the complexity of the plan. In addition to Gotti and Sammy, the core conspirators included Angelo Ruggiero, Gotti's closest friend and longtime partner in various criminal enterprises. Frank DiCicco, a respected capo whose support legitimized the conspiracy among family traditionalists. And Anthony Tony Roche Rampino, a feared killer whose reputation for violence would help intimidate potential opposition after the fact. The actual shooters would be soldiers and associates who could be trusted to follow orders without asking questions, and who had demonstrated their competence in previous violent operations. But the organizers understood that their own presence at the scene would be essential to send the right message to both family members and potential rivals about who was responsible for the change in leadership. Castellano's movements and security procedures had been studied for weeks. Unlike some crime bosses who surrounded themselves with extensive security details, Castellano typically traveled with only one or two bodyguards, relying more on his reputation and the general understanding that attacks on family leaders were extremely rare and inevitably led to massive retaliation. The dinner meeting at Sparks had been suggested by Frank DiCicco, who was trusted by Castellano and whose recommendation would not arouse suspicion. The restaurant was chosen because it offered several strategic advantages: multiple escape routes, heavy pedestrian traffic that would provide cover for the shooter's approach and withdrawal, and a location that would make it difficult for Castellano's bodyguards to establish effective security perimeters. On the evening of December 16th, Sammy positioned himself across the street from Sparks, ostensibly window shopping, but actually serving as a lookout and coordinator for the operation. He was dressed in an expensive overcoat and carried himself with the casual confidence of a successful businessman enjoying an evening in Manhattan. To casual observers, he was indistinguishable from the hundreds of other well-dressed professionals who populated the area during evening hours. His role in the assassination was crucial but not immediately visible. While Gotti would be the obvious successor to Castellano's position, and while the actual shooters would carry out the physical act of murder, Sammy was responsible for ensuring that the operation proceeded according to plan and that all participants understood their roles and timing. Through a small radio concealed in his coat, Sammy maintained communication with other members of the conspiracy positioned at strategic locations throughout the area. When Castellano's black Lincoln pulled up in front of the restaurant at approximately 5:25 p.m., Sammy transmitted the agreed-upon signal: the party's here. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but changed the history of American organized crime forever. As Castellano and his underboss Thomas Bilotti stepped out of their car, 4 men in identical long coats and Russian-style fur hats approached from different directions. The synchronization was perfect, the result of weeks of rehearsal and planning. The shooters opened fire simultaneously using .38 caliber revolvers that had been carefully prepared for the operation. Castellano was hit 6 times and died instantly on the sidewalk outside one of New York's most prestigious restaurants. Bilotti, attempting to draw his own weapon, was shot 3 times and fell beside his boss. The killers melted away into the crowd with the same precision they had shown in approaching their targets. Within minutes, they had discarded their distinctive coats and hats, changed their appearance, and disappeared into the Manhattan evening. By the time police arrived at the scene, the only evidence of their presence was the bodies of 2 of the most powerful men in organized crime. Sammy watched the entire operation unfold from his position across the street, his expression carefully neutral, despite the enormous significance of what he was witnessing. He had participated in numerous violent crimes over the years, but nothing approaching the magnitude of this public execution. The successful assassination of Paul Castellano represented both the ultimate demonstration of organized crime's power and a fundamental transformation in how that power would be exercised. As sirens began to wail in the distance and crowds of curious onlookers gathered around the crime scene, Sammy calmly walked away from the area, following a predetermined route that would take him to a safe location where he could monitor news coverage and await further instructions from Gotti. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was carefully orchestrated to minimize chaos within the Gambino family while sending clear messages to potential rivals and law enforcement agencies. Within hours of Castellano's death, John Gotti had assumed control of family operations, with Frank DiCicco serving as his underboss and Sammy being elevated to the position of capo with expanded responsibilities. For the family's most profitable enterprises, the transition was remarkably smooth, reflecting both the conspirators' careful planning and the widespread support for change among family members, who had grown dissatisfied with Castellano's leadership style, rather than the violent power struggle that often followed the assassination of a crime boss. The Gambino family experienced what amounted to a peaceful transfer of power that strengthened rather than weakened the organization. Media coverage of the assassination was extensive and largely focused on the audacious nature of the crime, rather than its potential implications for law enforcement efforts against organized crime. The image of Paul Castellano lying dead on a Manhattan sidewalk became iconic, symbolizing both the continuing power of the Mafia and the willingness of its leaders to use extreme violence to resolve internal disputes. But within law enforcement agencies, the assassination was recognized as a potential game changer that might provide new opportunities to penetrate and disrupt organized crime operations. The public nature of the killing, the obvious planning and hand coordination required, and the clear succession of leadership that followed all suggested that prosecutors might be able to build cases that would be much more difficult for defendants to deny or explain away. FBI surveillance teams had been monitoring various Gambino family members for months as part of ongoing investigations, and they had inadvertently documented some of the activities leading up to Castellano's assassination. While they hadn't been able to prevent the murder, they now possessed evidence that might be useful in building cases against the perpetrators. More importantly, the assassination created new pressures and vulnerabilities within the organization that law enforcement might be able to exploit. Family members who had been loyal to Castellano might be willing to cooperate with authorities if they felt threatened by the new leadership. Business associates who had worked with Castellano's legitimate enterprises might be more willing to provide information if they feared being targeted by Gotti's more aggressive approach to criminal operations. For Sammy, the successful assassination of Paul Castellano represented both the culmination of his rise through the Gambino family hierarchy and the beginning of a new phase in his criminal career. As one of Gotti's most trusted associates and a key participant in the conspiracy that had brought the new boss to power, he was positioned to benefit enormously from the changes that were transforming the organization. His construction enterprises, waste management, operations, and other business interests would continue to operate under the protection and with the support of the family's new leadership. But more importantly, he would now have access to opportunities and resources that had been unavailable under Castellano's more conservative approach to criminal enterprise. Gotti's vision for the Gambino family was more aggressive and more traditional than his predecessors had been, where Castellano had emphasized sophisticated, white-collar crimes and legitimate business investments. Gotti wanted to return to the street level, activities that had traditionally been the foundation of organized crime power. He believed that the family's strength came from its connection to neighborhood-based criminal operations and its willingness to use violence to enforce its will. This philosophical difference had profound implications for how the family would operate in the new environment created by increasingly aggressive federal law enforcement efforts. Gotti's approach was more likely to generate the kind of evidence that prosecutors could use in court, but it was also more likely to inspire loyalty among family members who felt that their new boss understood and respected their contributions to the organization. For Sammy, these changes created both opportunities and challenges. His demonstrated loyalty to Gotti and his crucial role in the conspiracy that had brought the new boss to power guaranteed him a prominent position in the reconfigured family structure. But the more aggressive approach that Gotti favored also meant greater risks, more law enforcement attention, and higher stakes for everyone involved in family operations. The assassination of Paul Castellano marked the end of one era in the history of the Gambino crime family and the beginning of another. It established John Gotti as one of the most powerful and visible crime bosses in America, with Sammy Gravano serving as his most trusted lieutenant and strategic advisor. But it also set in motion a series of events that would ultimately lead to the downfall of both men and the destruction of much of what they had worked their entire careers to build. The very audacity that had made the Castellano assassination possible would eventually prove to be their undoing as law enforcement. Agencies adapted their methods to the new realities of organized crime, and as the consequences of their violent actions began to catch up with them, the golden age of John Gotti and Sammy Gravano was about to begin, but so was the countdown to their ultimate destruction. The years immediately following Paul Castellano's assassination marked the apex of John Gotti's power and influence within the American Mafia, and by extension, the period of Sammy Gravano's greatest authority and prosperity within the criminal underworld. Together, they transformed the Gambino family into what many considered the most powerful and feared organized crime organization in the United States, while simultaneously making themselves targets of the most intensive law enforcement investigation in the history of American organized crime. Gotti's ascension to the position of family boss was ratified in a formal ceremony held just weeks after Castellano's death in a private room in a restaurant in Queens that had been carefully secured against electronic surveillance. The ceremony followed ancient traditions that connected the new boss to generations of mafia leaders, while adapting to the modern realities of criminal enterprise in the 1980s. Sammy's elevation to the position of underboss was announced at the same ceremony, making him at age 40 one of the youngest men ever to hold such a high position in a major crime family. The appointment reflected not only Gotti's trust in his strategic abilities, but also the new boss's understanding that the changing landscape of organized crime required leadership that could adapt to evolving challenges. The partnership between Gotti and Gravano was complementary in ways that made their combined leadership extraordinarily effective. Gotti possessed the charisma and street credibility that inspired fierce loyalty among the family's soldiers and associates. He was a natural leader who commanded respect through his personal presence and his reputation for standing up to anyone who challenged the family's interests. Sammy provided the analytical thinking and business expertise that turned Gotti's instinctive leadership into systematic criminal enterprise. Where Gotti saw opportunities for expansion and domination, Sammy developed the detailed plans and organizational structures that made those opportunities profitable and sustainable. Their complementary skills were evident in how they restructured the family's operations to maximize both profits and power. Under Castellano, the organization had been run like a loose confederation of semi-independent crews that paid tribute to the boss while managing their own territories and criminal enterprises. Gotti and Sammy centralized authority while maintaining the flexibility that allowed individual operators to pursue their own opportunities within the overall framework of family policy. The centerpiece of their new approach was an expansion of the construction industry operations that had made Sammy wealthy and powerful during the Castellano years, but where the previous leadership had focused primarily on concrete supply and general contracting. The new regime extended organized crime's reach into virtually every aspect of the building trades throughout the New York metropolitan area. The key was understanding that modern construction projects required coordination among dozens of different specialties: electrical work, plumbing, steel fabrication, masonry, carpentry, and many others. By establishing influence or control over multiple trades simultaneously, the family could ensure that their interests were protected at every stage of major construction projects while also maximizing their profit opportunities. Sammy spearheaded this expansion, using his existing relationships with contractors, union officials, and municipal bureaucrats to create what amounted to a shadow government that operated parallel to legitimate regulatory and business structures. Projects that had the family's approval proceeded smoothly and profitably for everyone involved. Projects that didn't have such approval often encountered mysterious problems that made them expensive, time-consuming, or impossible to complete. The waste management operations that Sammy had helped establish during the late 1970s were similarly expanded under the new leadership. What had begun as territorial arrangements among competing crime families evolved into a comprehensive cartel that controlled garbage collection throughout much of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. The profits generated by these expanded operations were enormous, but more important was the political and economic influence they provided. Construction companies and waste management firms that depended on organized crimes protection or cooperation found themselves in relationships that extended far beyond simple business transactions. They became part of a network of mutual obligation and shared interest that gave the family influence in legitimate business and political circles that previous generations of criminals had never possessed. This influence was particularly valuable when dealing with law enforcement investigations and prosecutions. While the family could not prevent federal agencies from pursuing their cases, they could sometimes influence how those cases were investigated, what evidence was available to prosecutors, and how cooperative witnesses and victims would be when testifying in court. But the most significant change under the Gotti Gravano leadership was the family's approach to violence and intimidation. Where Castellano had preferred to resolve disputes through negotiation and economic pressure, Gotti believed that the credible threat of violence was essential to maintaining respect and discipline within the criminal community. This philosophy was demonstrated in numerous incidents throughout the late 1980s when the family's response to various challenges sent clear messages about the consequences of opposing their interests. Business competitors who refused to respect territorial boundaries found themselves facing escalating problems that culminated in physical attacks on their property or personnel. Law enforcement informants discovered that their cooperation with authorities made them targets for retaliation that could extend to their families and associates. One of the most significant demonstrations of the new leadership's approach came in 1987 when a rival crime family attempted to muscle in on several of the Gambino's most profitable gambling operations in Queens. Rather than negotiate a territorial compromise as Castellano might have done, Gotti and Sammy decided to respond with overwhelming force that would discourage future challenges while solidifying their reputation for ruthlessness. The campaign against the interlopers was swift, systematic, and devastating. Within a period of 2 weeks, 3 members of the rival organization were murdered in public locations throughout Queens, their deaths clearly linked to their attempts to encroach on Gambino territory. Several others were severely beaten and left with permanent injuries that serve as visible reminders of what happened to people who challenged the family's interests. More importantly, the family's response included attacks on the rival organization's legitimate business interests, and family members demonstrating that the consequences of opposing the Gambinos extended far beyond the individuals directly involved in criminal activities. The message was received and understood throughout the criminal community. The Gambino family under Gotti and Gravano was not an organization that could be challenged with impunity. These demonstrations of power had their intended effect on both criminal rivals and legitimate business associates. The family's territories became more secure, their criminal enterprises more profitable, and their influence more extensive than had been the case under any previous leadership. By the late 1980s, the Gambino family was widely acknowledged as the premier organized crime organization in the United States, with operations that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually and influence that extended into legitimate business labor unions and political circles. But the same aggressive approach that made the family so powerful also made it a priority target for federal law enforcement agencies that were developing new methods and technologies for investigating organized crime. The racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations. RICO Act, passed in 1970 but not fully utilized until the 1980s, provided prosecutors with legal tools that were specifically designed to dismantle criminal organizations, like the one Gotti and Sammy had built. Under RICO, prosecutors could charge the leaders of criminal organizations, not just with specific crimes, but with operating criminal enterprises that systematically violated federal law. The penalties for RICO violations were severe, potentially life imprisonment for leaders of organizations that could be shown to have engaged in patterns of criminal activity over extended periods. More troubling from the family's perspective was the sophisticated surveillance technology that federal agencies were deploying against organized crime targets. Electronic surveillance, wiretapped telephone conversations, and hidden cameras were providing law enforcement with unprecedented insight into how criminal organizations actually operated, what their leaders actually said when they thought they were speaking privately, and how their various enterprises were actually structured and managed. The FBI had been conducting intensive surveillance of Gotti and other family members since shortly after Castellano's assassination, understanding that the new leadership represented both a more dangerous criminal organization and a more vulnerable target for prosecution. Their investigations were producing evidence that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional methods. Recorded conversations in which criminal activities were discussed in detailed documentation of money flows between legitimate and illegitimate enterprises, and testimony from cooperating witnesses who revealed the internal workings of the organization. By 1989, federal prosecutors in Manhattan had assembled what they believed was a comprehensive case against the Gambino family's leadership, based on years of surveillance, dozens of recorded conversations, and testimony from several cooperating witnesses who had provided detailed information about the organization's structure and activities. The indictments, when they finally came, would represent the most serious challenge that any American crime family had ever faced from law enforcement. Unlike previous prosecutions that had focused on specific crimes or individual criminals, the new cases were designed to destroy entire organizations by imprisoning their leadership and seizing their assets. For John Gotti and Sammy Gravano, the golden years of power and prosperity were about to end. The very success that had made them legends in the young criminal underworld had also made them targets of a legal system that was finally equipped with the tools and techniques necessary to bring down even the most powerful organized crime figures. The countdown to their destruction had already begun, though they didn't yet understand how little time they had left. By 1990, the walls were closing in on the Gambino family with the inexorable pressure of a slowly tightening vice. Federal investigators had spent nearly 5 years building cases against John Gotti and his organization, using surveillance techniques and legal strategies that represented the cutting edge of law enforcement's war against organized crime. What they had assembled was not just evidence of specific criminal acts, but a comprehensive documentation of how the most powerful crime family in America actually operated. The investigation was centered at the FBI's New York office, where a task force of agents, prosecutors, and analysts had made the destruction of the Gambino family their primary mission. They had invested thousands of hours in surveillance operations, deployed the most sophisticated electronic monitoring equipment available, and recruited informants who provided unprecedented insight into the organization's internal workings. The breakthrough had come in 1989 when FBI agents succeeded in planting listening devices inside the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, which served as Gotti's unofficial headquarters. The club was where he met with subordinates, discussed family business, and made the decisions that affected criminal operations throughout New York and beyond. For months, the FBI recorded conversations that provided exactly the kind of evidence that RICO prosecutions require: detailed discussions of criminal activities, planning sessions for illegal enterprises, and most damaging of all, Gotti's own words describing his role as the leader of a criminal organization and his approval of various crimes committed by his subordinates. But perhaps the most shocking discovery for investigators was the extent to which Gotti criticized and disparaged Sammy Gravano in private conversations, despite their public appearance of partnership and mutual respect. The wiretapped conversations revealed Gotti complaining about his underbosses' business methods, questioning his loyalty, and expressing frustration with what he saw as Sammy's excessive focus on legitimate business ventures. "That fat fuck thinks he's smarter than everybody else," Gotti was recorded saying in one particularly damning conversation. "He's got his construction deals and his restaurants, and he thinks he's some kind of legitimate businessman, but when push comes to shove, he better remember who made him and who can break him." The FBI agents monitoring these conversations understood immediately that they had discovered a potential weakness in what appeared to be an unbreakable partnership. If Gotti was privately expressing doubts about Gravano's loyalty, and if Gravano was unaware of his boss's true feelings, there might be an opportunity to drive a wedge between the two men that could benefit the prosecution's case. The strategy that emerged from this insight would prove to be one of the most successful law enforcement operations in the history of organized crime investigation. Rather than simply building cases against both men, simultaneously prosecutors decided to arrest them together, but then provide Gravano with evidence of Gotti's private criticisms, hoping to convince him that his loyalty to his boss was not reciprocated, and that his best chance for survival lay in cooperation with the government. The arrests came on December 11, 1990, as coordinated raids swept through Brooklyn and Queens, targeting not just Gotti and Gravano, but dozens of other family members and associates. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. More than 100 FBI agents participated in arrests that were designed to cripple the Gambino family's entire leadership structure simultaneously. Gotti was arrested at the Ravenite Social Club, handcuffed in front of a gathered crowd of neighborhood residents and media representatives who had been attracted by the massive law enforcement presence. The image of the dapper Don being led away in handcuffs became one of the most iconic photographs in the history of organized crime prosecution, symbolizing the government's determination to bring down even the most powerful criminal leaders. Sammy was arrested at his home in Brooklyn, surrounded by FBI agents who had been watching his movements for months and knew exactly when and where to find him. Unlike Gotti, who maintained his characteristic bravado even in handcuffs, Sammy appeared shaken by the arrest, perhaps understanding more clearly than his boss how serious their legal situation had become. The indictments that followed the arrests were comprehensive and devastating. Under RICO statutes, Gotti and Gravano were charged not just with specific crimes, but with operating a criminal enterprise. that had systematically corrupted major sectors of the New York economy. The charges included murder, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, labor racketeering, and conspiracy. A catalog of criminal activities that carried potential sentences of life imprisonment without parole. But more damaging than the specific charges was the evidence that prosecutors possessed to support them. The wiretapped conversations from the Ravenite Social Club provided direct proof of the defendants' criminal activities in their own words. Surveillance photographs documented meetings with known criminals and participation in suspicious activities. Financial records traced the flow of money between legitimate businesses and illegal enterprises. Perhaps most importantly, several members of the organization had already agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences, providing insider testimony about how the family operated and what roles various individuals played in its criminal activities. These cooperating witnesses could provide context and interpretation for the electronic evidence, while also testifying about crimes that had not been captured on surveillance equipment. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney John Gleason, a young but experienced prosecutor who had made organized crime cases his specialty. Gleason understood that this was potentially a career-defining case that could either establish his reputation as one of the country's most effective prosecutors or damage it permanently if the defendants were acquitted despite the extensive evidence against them. Gleason's strategy was methodical and comprehensive. Rather than focusing on a few dramatic incidents, he planned to present evidence of the entire scope of the defendants' criminal activities, demonstrating that they had operated a criminal enterprise that affected virtually every aspect of economic life in their territory. The case would show the jury not just that crimes had been committed, but that the defendants had created and managed a systematic criminal organization that corrupted legitimate businesses, terrorized honest citizens, and generated enormous profits through illegal activities. For Gotti, the prosecution represented the ultimate test of his ability to beat the legal system that had been trying unsuccessfully to convict him for decades. He had been arrested numerous times throughout his career, but had never been successfully prosecuted on serious charges, earning him a reputation as the Teflon Don because criminal charges never seemed to stick to him. His approach to the new charges was consistent with his previous strategy: hire the best defense lawyers available, attack the credibility of government witnesses, and rely on his reputation and charisma to convince jurors that he was being persecuted rather than prosecuted. He believed that his previous acquittals demonstrated that the government's cases against him were fundamentally weak, and that this prosecution would end the same way as the others. But Sammy's situation was more complex and potentially more dangerous. Unlike Gotti, he had no experience with major federal prosecutions and no established track record of beating serious criminal charges. His criminal career had been built on avoiding arrests and prosecutions rather than surviving them, and the evidence against him appeared to be much more extensive and damaging than anything he had faced before. More troubling was his gradual realization that his relationship with Gotti was not what he had believed it to be. The wiretapped conversations that prosecutors played for him during pretrial proceedings revealed a pattern of criticism and disrespect that completely contradicted Gotti's public treatment of him as a trusted partner and valued advisor. "You need to understand something," Prosecutor Gleason told Sammy during one of their early meetings. "John Gotti doesn't respect you. He doesn't trust you, and he certainly doesn't care about what happens to you." These are his own words recorded when he thought nobody was listening. "He thinks you're weak, he thinks you're greedy, and he thinks you're expendable." The revelation was devastating to Sammy, who had believed that his loyalty to Gotti was reciprocated and that their partnership was based on genuine mutual respect. To learn that he had been deceived about something so fundamental challenged everything he thought he understood. about his position within the organization and his prospects for surviving the legal challenges they were facing. The prosecution strategy was working exactly as intended. By demonstrating to Gravano that his loyalty to Gotti was not reciprocated, they were creating conditions that might lead him to reconsider his options and potentially decide that cooperation with the government was his best chance for survival. But the decision that Sammy was being asked to make was not just about legal strategy or personal survival. It was about betraying everything he had believed in for his entire adult life, violating the oath he had taken as a member of the Gambino family, and abandoning the code of silence that had governed his behavior for more than 25 years. The choice he ultimately made would not just determine his own fate, but would fundamentally alter the landscape of American organized crime and establish precedents that would influence law enforcement strategies for decades to come. The most famous turncoat in the history of organized crime was about to be born. The federal detention facility in Manhattan was a gray concrete monument to the proposition that justice required removing dangerous individuals from society while their cases proceeded through the courts. For John Gotti and Sammy Gravano, it became their home for months as they awaited trial on charges that could result in life imprisonment. A sterile environment where the only sounds were the echoes of footsteps on concrete floors and the metallic clang of doors that locked automatically behind anyone who passed through them. The facility housed hundreds of defendants awaiting trial on federal charges, but few commanded the attention and respect that Gotti received from both inmates and correctional staff. Even in prison clothes, he maintained the bearing and confidence that had made him a legend in the criminal underworld, treating his confinement as a temporary inconvenience rather than a serious threat to his future. Sammy's adjustment to incarceration was more difficult. While he had been arrested before, he had never faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, never been confronted with evidence that appeared as overwhelming as what the prosecutors had assembled against him. The walls of his cell seemed to close in on him during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, and he found himself contemplating a future that looked increasingly bleak. The two men were housed in different sections of the facility, partly for security reasons, and partly because prosecutors hoped that limiting their communication might create opportunities for one or both of them to reconsider their options. But even when they were able to meet, their conversations were constrained by the knowledge that everything they said might be monitored and recorded for use against them at trial. It was during one of these awkward meetings that Sammy first raised the possibility that their situation might be more serious than Gotti seemed to believe. "John, I've been looking at the evidence they say they have against us," Sammy said, carefully knowing that their conversation might be overheard. "This isn't like your previous cases. They've got recordings, photographs, financial documents, and cooperating witnesses. This is different." Gotti's response was characteristically confident. "It's never different," he said dismissively. "The government always claims they have an airtight case, and then when we get to trial, their witnesses fall apart and their evidence turns out to be garbage. We've been through this before, and we'll beat it again." But Sammy had been studying the prosecution's evidence more carefully than his boss, and what he saw genuinely frightened him. The wiretapped conversations were particularly damaging because they captured both men discussing criminal activities in their own voices, using language that would be difficult to explain away or reinterpret for a jury. More troubling were the financial records that traced money flows between their legitimate businesses and their illegal enterprises. Sammy had always prided himself on the sophistication of his money laundering operations, but the government's forensic accountants had apparently succeeded in following paper trails that he had believed were impossible to trace. Perhaps most damaging of all were the cooperating witnesses who were providing insider testimony about the organization's structure and activities. These weren't street-level criminals whose credibility could be easily attacked, but longtime family members who had detailed knowledge of the most sensitive aspects of the organization's operations. As the weeks passed and more details of the prosecution's case became available through the discovery process, Sammy found himself increasingly convinced that conviction was not just possible but probable. The evidence was simply too extensive, too detailed, and too well corroborated to be effectively challenged through traditional defense strategies. But what troubled him even more than the strength of the government's case was his growing realization that his relationship with Gotti was fundamentally different from what he had believed. The prosecutors had been selectively sharing portions of the wiretapped conversations with him, and what he heard was deeply disturbing. The John Gotti captured on those recordings was not the loyal partner and respected boss that Sammy thought he knew. Instead, he was a man who spoke contemptuously of his underboss, questioned his competence, and seemed to view him as a useful but ultimately expendable subordinate rather than a valued partner. "He thinks I'm weak," Sammy confided to his attorney during one of their meetings. 25 years I've been loyal to this man. 25 years I've risked everything for the family. And this is what he really thinks of me." His attorney, Benjamin Braffman, was one of New York's most experienced criminal defense lawyers with a reputation for successfully defending clients in complex white-collar cases. But even Braffman was having difficulty seeing how they could mount an effective defense against the evidence that prosecutors had assembled. "The reality is that we're facing a very difficult situation," Braffman told him honestly. "The government's case is stronger than anything I've seen in 20 years of practice. The recordings are devastating, the financial evidence is comprehensive, and the cooperating witnesses are credible. Unless something changes dramatically, I think we have to consider the possibility that conviction is inevitable." It was during these discussions with his attorney that Sammy first learned about the government's willingness to consider cooperation agreements with defendants who provided substantial assistance in prosecuting other criminals. Such agreements could result in significant sentence reductions, placement in the witness protection program, and other considerations that might make survival possible even after conviction. "I'm not saying you should cooperate," Braffman emphasized. "That's a decision only you can make, and it carries risks that go far beyond legal considerations. But I think you need to understand all of your options before making final decisions about how to proceed." The idea of cooperation was initially so foreign to everything Sammy believed about loyalty and honor that he refused to consider it seriously. He had taken an oath as a made member of the Gambino family that specifically required him to maintain silence even unto death, rather than betray the organization's secrets. The Code of Omerta was not just a cultural tradition. It was the foundation of his identity and the organizing principle of his entire adult life. But as the evidence against him continued to mount and his prospects for acquittal continued to diminish, he found himself thinking about cooperation not as betrayal, but as survival. The organization he had served so loyally for 25 years had apparently never valued his loyalty. The boss he had risked everything to support had never respected his contributions. The family he had considered more important than his biological family had never reciprocated his devotion. The turning point came when prosecutors provided him with additional recordings that revealed the extent to which Gotti had been criticizing him to other family members. In conversation after conversation, his boss portrayed him as greedy, unreliable, and potentially disloyal, exactly the opposite of how Sammy saw himself and his contributions to the organization. "This son of a bitch has been undermining me for years," he told Braffman after hearing the most damaging recordings. "While I was out there making money for the family, taking risks, handling problems, he was sitting in that social club telling people I couldn't be trusted. He's destroyed my reputation within the organization while pretending to be my friend." The psychological impact of these revelations cannot be overstated. Sammy's entire adult identity had been built around his role as a loyal and valued member of the Gambino family. To learn that his loyalty had never been reciprocated, that his contributions had never been properly valued, and that his reputation had been systematically undermined by the very person he had served most faithfully, was devastating in ways that went far beyond the immediate legal consequences he was facing. But there were also practical considerations that influenced his thinking. Even if he somehow managed to avoid conviction, his position within the organization had been irreparably damaged by Gotti's recorded criticisms. Other family members who heard those recordings would inevitably question his competence and reliability, making it difficult or impossible for him to function effectively in his previous role. More importantly, the aggressive law enforcement attention that the family was receiving made it unlikely that their criminal enterprises could continue operating profitably in the foreseeable future. The days of easy money from construction and waste management operations were probably replaced by a much more dangerous environment where every business decision carried the risk of additional criminal charges and longer prison sentences. His family situation also weighed heavily on his decision-making process. His wife Deborah and their children had enjoyed the prosperity that his criminal career had provided, but they had also lived with the constant stress and danger that such a lifestyle entailed. The prospect of his spending the rest of his life in prison would leave them not just emotionally devastated, but also financially vulnerable, since much of his legitimate business interests were likely to be seized by the government as proceeds of criminal activity. After weeks of agonizing consideration, Sammy made the decision that would define the rest of his life and change the history of American organized crime forever. He instructed his attorney to approach prosecutors about the possibility of a cooperation agreement that would allow him to provide testimony against John Gotti and other members of the Gambino family in exchange for a reduced sentence and placement in the federal witness protection program. The decision was not made lightly or quickly. It represented the abandonment of everything he had believed in for his entire adult life, betrayal of men who had trusted him with their lives and their secrets, and the destruction of relationships that had sustained him through decades of criminal activity. But it was also, as he saw it, the only rational response to a situation in which his loyalty had never been reciprocated, his contributions had never been properly valued, and his future within the organization had been irreparably damaged by the very person he had served most faithfully. The most famous turncoat in the history of organized crime was about to be born, and his testimony would bring down not just John Gotti, but the entire structure of the criminal organization that had dominated New York for decades. The meeting took place on November 8, 1990, one in a secure conference room at the FBI's New York field office, a sterile environment designed to prevent electronic surveillance, while providing maximum security for participants in sensitive discussions. The room contained only a rectangular table, several chairs, and recording equipment that would preserve every word spoken during what would become one of the most significant debriefing sessions in the history of American law enforcement. Present at the meeting were Assistant U.S. Attorney John Gleason, several FBI agents who had worked on the Gambino family investigation, and Sammy Gravano's attorney, Benjamin Braffman. But the central figure was Sammy himself, who sat across from federal prosecutors he had spent his entire adult life viewing as enemies and prepared to bet his life on their willingness to honor promises made in exchange for his cooperation. The atmosphere was tense, but businesslike. Everyone in the room understood the historical significance of what was about to occur. The underboss of America's most powerful crime family was prepared to violate the most sacred principle of organized crime by providing detailed testimony about the organization's structure, activities, and leadership. Such cooperation was not unprecedented, but it had never before involved someone of Sammy's stature and knowledge. Gleason began the debriefing session by explaining the terms of the cooperation agreement that the government was prepared to offer in exchange for complete and truthful testimony about his knowledge of criminal activities within the Gambino family. Sammy would plead guilty to racketeering, charges that carried a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison, but prosecutors would recommend a significant reduction in that sentence based on the extent and value of his cooperation. More importantly, he and his immediate family would be placed in the Federal Witness Protection Program, which would provide them with new identities, relocation to a secure location, and ongoing protection from retaliation by organized crime figures who might want to silence him permanently. "Let me be absolutely clear about what we're asking for," Gleason said, looking directly at Sammy across the table. "We need complete honesty about everything you know. We need details about criminal activities you participated in or witnessed. We need information about the organizational structure of the family, the roles of various individuals, and the methods used to conduct criminal enterprises. If you lie to us about anything, if you hold back information that we later discover independently, the agreement is void, and you'll face the maximum penalties allowed by law." Sammy nodded his understanding, though the magnitude of what he was agreeing to was almost overwhelming. He was about to provide prosecutors with information that would result in the arrests and convictions of dozens of men who had trusted him, worked with him, and considered him family. Some of these men had been his closest friends for decades. Others had saved his life or risked their own lives to protect him. But he had crossed a psychological line from which there was no return. The wiretapped conversations had revealed to him that his loyalty to the organization had never been reciprocated by its leadership. John Gotti's private criticisms had destroyed any remaining sense of obligation he felt toward his boss or the criminal enterprise they had built together. "I understand what you're asking," he replied quietly, "and I'm prepared to give you what you need." What followed was the most comprehensive debriefing of a high-level organized crime figure in American history. Over the course of 18 sessions spanning several months, Sammy provided prosecutors with detailed information about virtually every aspect of the Gambino family's operations, from street-level gambling and loan sharking to sophisticated construction industry, racketeering, and murder conspiracies. His testimony was extraordinarily valuable, not just because of his high position within the organization, but because of his analytical mind and remarkable memory for detail. Unlike many cooperating witnesses who could provide only general information about criminal activities they had observed, Sammy was able to describe the complex business relationships, financial structures, and operational procedures that made the family's criminal enterprises so profitable and difficult to prosecute. He explained how the concrete cartel operated, naming the specific individuals who controlled various aspects of the industry, and describing the methods used to fix prices, allocate contracts, and eliminate competition. He detailed the waste management operations that generated millions of dollars in illegal profits, while appearing to be legitimate business activities. He provided comprehensive information about gambling enterprises, loan sharking operations, and labor racketeering schemes that prosecutors had been unable to fully understand despite years of investigation. But perhaps most significantly, he provided detailed testimony about the murders he had participated in or witnessed during his criminal career. Unlike previous cooperating witnesses who had been peripheral figures in violent crimes, Sammy had been a central participant in 19 murders committed between 1970 and 1990, including several that had been ordered by John Gotti personally. His descriptions of these murders were clinical in their detail and devastating in their implications for the defendants he was testifying against. He could describe not just what had happened, but why it had happened, who had ordered the killings, and how they fit into the larger patterns of organizational discipline, and territorial control that governed the criminal underworld. The murder of Paul Castellano was naturally a central focus of his testimony. For the first time, prosecutors had an insider's account of how the assassination had been planned and executed, who had participated in the conspiracy, and what role John Gotti had played in orchestrating the most significant organized crime murder in American history. John made the decision. Sammy testified, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, despite the enormous implications of what he was revealing. He convinced us that Paul had lost touch with what the family was supposed to be about, that he was more interested in his legitimate businesses than in protecting the soldiers who did the real work. And when the federal cases started coming down, John became convinced that Paul might cooperate to save himself. He described the planning sessions, the selection of shooters, the coordination of the operation, and the immediate aftermath when Gotti assumed control of the family. His testimony provided prosecutors with the kind of insider evidence that would be virtually impossible to challenge in court, since he had been present for the most sensitive conversations and had participated directly in the most crucial decisions. But the psychological toll of providing this testimony was enormous. Each session required him to relive violent incidents that he had spent years trying to forget, to betray confidences that men had shared with him in moments of trust, and to systematically destroy relationships that had defined his adult life. The most difficult sessions were those dealing with murders he had committed personally or had directly ordered. While he had always been able to rationalize these killings as necessary business decisions or responses to threats against the organization, describing them to federal prosecutors forced him to confront the human cost of his choices in ways he had always avoided. "I've killed 19 people," he said during one particularly difficult session, his voice barely above a whisper. 19 human beings who had families, who had children, who had lives and dreams and hopes. I told myself for years that it was just business, that it was necessary to protect the family and maintain discipline. But sitting here now, having to describe each one of these murders in detail, I can't hide from what I really am. I'm a monster who destroyed lives for money and power. The FBI agents and prosecutors conducting the debriefing were impressed by both the comprehensiveness of Sammy's knowledge and the apparent honesty of his testimony. Unlike many cooperating witnesses who tried to minimize their own roles in criminal activities while emphasizing the guilt of others, Sammy was brutally honest about his own actions and motivations. This honesty made his testimony more credible, but it also made it more damaging to himself. By providing detailed accounts of murders he had committed, criminal enterprises he had operated, and illegal activities he had participated in, he was essentially providing prosecutors with evidence that could be used to convict him of crimes that carried potential death sentences. But the cooperation agreement protected him from such additional charges in exchange for his complete honesty about past activities. The government needed his testimony more than they needed to prosecute him for crimes they might not have been able to prove without his cooperation. As word of Sammy's cooperation began to circulate within the criminal community, the reaction was swift and predictable. He was branded a traitor and a rat, terms that carried enormous stigma within a culture that valued loyalty above all other virtues. Former associates who had considered him a friend and mentor now spoke of him with contempt and hatred. More ominously, his cooperation made him a target for retaliation by organized crime figures who saw his testimony as a threat to their own security and the stability of their criminal enterprises. The Witness Protection Program would provide some security for him and his family, but it could not completely eliminate the risks associated with betraying the secrets of America's most violent criminal organization. John Gotti's reaction to news of his underbosses' cooperation was characteristic of his personality, a combination of rage, disbelief, and wounded pride at his most trusted lieutenant had betrayed him in the most public and humiliating way possible. That fat piece of garbage, he was recorded saying during one of his few remaining opportunities to speak privately with family members. 25 years I treated him like a brother. 25 years I made him rich and powerful, and this is how he repays me. He's destroyed everything we built together. But Gotti's anger could not change the reality of his situation. With Sammy's testimony added to the extensive electronic surveillance evidence and other cooperating witnesses, the government's case had become virtually unwinnable through conventional defense strategies. The man who had been known as the Teflon Dome was about to face charges that would stick permanently. The stage was set for what would become known as the trial of the century, a legal proceeding that would not only determine the fate of John Gotti and his co-defendants, but would also establish precedents for how the government would prosecute organized crime cases in the future. At the center of it all would be Sammy Gravano, the most important cooperating witness in the history of American organized crime, whose decision to break the code of omerta would forever change the landscape of criminal prosecution and criminal defense in cases involving organized crime. The man who had once been one of the most feared figures in the American Mafia was about to become its most devastating enemy. The federal courthouse in Brooklyn was transformed into an armed fortress on March 2nd, 1990, to the opening day of what media outlets had dubbed the trial of the century. Sharpshooters positioned on surrounding rooftops scanned the crowds of reporters, curiosity seekers, and law enforcement personnel who had gathered to witness what many considered the most significant organized crime prosecution in American history. Inside the courthouse, metal detectors and armed marshals provided additional layers of security for a trial that everyone understood carried unprecedented stakes for both the government and organized crime. The defendant was John Gotti, the man who had become the public face of the American Mafia. Through his expensive suit's confident demeanor and remarkable ability to avoid conviction despite decades of criminal activity. Sitting beside him at the defense table were Frank Locascio, who had succeeded Sammy Gravano as underboss of the Gambino family, and Thomas Gambino, a capo whose conviction would demonstrate that the government's reach extended throughout the organization's hierarchy. But the most important figure in the courtroom was not seated at either the prosecution or defense table. Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano was scheduled to testify as the government's star witness, a man whose cooperation had made this prosecution possible and whose testimony would either validate or destroy the government's case against his former boss and associates. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney John Gleason, who had spent months preparing for what he knew would be the most challenging and significant case of his career. The evidence against Gotti was extensive and damaging, but Gleason understood that the trial would ultimately be won or lost based on the jury's assessment of Sammy Gravano's credibility as a witness. Gleason's opening statement was methodical and comprehensive, laying out for the jury the structure and activities of the Gambino crime family in language that was clear and accessible to ordinary citizens who had no previous knowledge of how organized crime actually operated. Ladies and gentlemen, Gleason began over the next several weeks. You will hear evidence about one of the most sophisticated and violent criminal organizations in American history. You will learn how this organization generated hundreds of millions of dollars through illegal activities that corrupted legitimate businesses, terrorized honest citizens, and turned violence into a routine business practice. He described the hierarchical structure of the family, the various criminal enterprises it operated, and the methods used to maintain discipline and secrecy within the organization. But most importantly, he prepared the jury for the testimony they would hear from Salvatore Gravano, explaining why the government had entered into a cooperation agreement with such a high-ranking criminal figure. You will hear testimony from a man who was John Gotti's underboss, his second-in-command, and one of his closest associates for more than a decade. Gleason explained. This witness will tell you about crimes he participated in, murders he committed, and illegal activities he helped organize. His testimony will not be pleasant to hear, and you may find yourself questioning why the government has entered into an agreement with such a person. Gleason paused, making eye contact with each member of the jury before continuing. But you will also learn that this witness has provided information that could only have come from someone at the very heart of this criminal organization. His testimony has been corroborated by extensive electronic surveillance, financial records, and testimony from other witnesses. And perhaps most importantly, you will learn that his decision to cooperate came only after he discovered that his loyalty to John Gotti was not reciprocated, that the man he had served faithfully for decades had been privately criticizing and undermining him, even while publicly treating him as a trusted partner. The defense strategy developed by Gotti's attorney Albert Krieger was to attack the credibility and motivations of the government's cooperating witnesses while portraying the prosecution as a politically motivated attack on Italian-American culture and traditions. Krieger argued that his client was being persecuted rather than prosecuted, targeted by ambitious federal prosecutors who were more interested in generating headlines than in pursuing justice. But the centerpiece of the defense strategy was a systematic attack on Sammy Gravano's character, motivations, and credibility. Krieger planned to argue that Gravano was a pathological liar and manipulative sociopath who had betrayed his closest associates to save himself from well-deserved punishment for his own crimes. The government's case depends entirely on the testimony of a man who has admitted to murdering 19 people, Krieger told the jury during his opening statement. This is a man who has lied, cheated, and killed throughout his adult life, who has betrayed every trust that was ever placed in him, and who is now trying to save himself from life imprisonment by telling prosecutors whatever they want to hear. The courtroom was packed throughout the trial with reporters, law enforcement officials, and members of the organized crime community closely following every development in a case that would establish important precedents for future prosecutions. The media coverage was extensive and generally favorable to the prosecution, though defense attorneys complained that the pretrial publicity had made it impossible for their clients to receive fair trials. When Sammy Gravano finally took the witness stand on March 2nd, the courtroom fell silent as spectators and participants realized they were witnessing a historic moment. For the first time in the history of American organized crime, an underboss of a major crime family was testifying in detail about the organization's structure, activities, and leadership. Sammy's appearance had changed dramatically since his arrest. Gone were the expensive suits and confident bearing that had marked his years as a powerful crime figure. In their place was a middle-aged man in prison clothes who looked smaller and more vulnerable than the feared criminal that the prosecution witnesses had described in their testimony. But his voice was steady and his manner calm as prosecutor. John Gleason began the direct examination that would make or break the government's case. Mr. Gravano, what was your position in the Gambino crime family? Gleason asked. I was the underboss under John Gotti. Sammy replied, his words carrying clearly throughout the silent courtroom. Can you explain to the jury what that position entailed? The underboss is the second highest position in a crime family. Sammy explained matter-of-factly. I was responsible for overseeing the family's day-to-day operations, mediating disputes between different crews, and serving as the primary liaison between the boss and the capos who managed various criminal enterprises. Over the course of 9 days of testimony, Sammy provided the jury with an insider's view of organized crime that was unprecedented in its detail and comprehensiveness. He described the family's organizational structure, its various criminal enterprises, and the methods used to maintain discipline and loyalty within the organization. More importantly, he provided specific testimony about John Gotti's role in ordering murders, approving criminal activities, and managing the organization's affairs. His testimony was supported by wiretapped conversations that captured Gotti discussing many of the same criminal activities that Sammy described from personal knowledge. The most dramatic moments in his testimony came when he described the assassination of Paul Castellano, providing details about the planning, execution, and aftermath of the most significant organized crime murder in American history. John told us that Paul had to go. Sammy testified, his voice remaining steady despite the enormous implications of his words. He said Paul had lost touch with what the family was supposed to be about, and he was worried that Paul might cooperate with the government to avoid spending his life in prison. He described the planning meetings, the selection of shooters, and his own role as a lookout during the actual assassination. His testimony provided prosecutors with evidence that directly linked John Gotti to premeditated murder, supported by electronic surveillance and other corroborating evidence. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Sammy's testimony was his obvious knowledge of details that only someone at the very heart of the organization could have possessed. He could describe not just what had happened, but why it had happened, how decisions were made, and what considerations influenced the family's leadership in their various criminal activities. The cross-examination by Albert Krieger was aggressive and confrontational, designed to portray Sammy as an unreliable witness whose testimony was motivated by self-interest rather than a commitment to truth. "Mr. Gravano, isn't it true that you're testifying against John Gotti because you want to reduce your own sentence?" Krieger demanded. "That's one reason," Sammy admitted honestly. "But it's not the only reason. What other reasons do you have?" "I found out that John had been lying to me for years about his feelings toward me and my contributions to the family. The wiretapped conversations showed me that he never respected me or valued my loyalty the way I thought he did." Krieger pressed him on his motivations, his criminal history, and his credibility as a witness. But Sammy's responses were consistently straightforward and difficult to impeach. Unlike many cooperating witnesses who tried to minimize their own roles in criminal activities, Sammy was brutally honest about his own actions while providing devastating testimony about Gotti's leadership of the organization. The defense also called several character witnesses who testified about Gotti's reputation in his neighborhood and his legitimate business activities. But these witnesses could not effectively counter the extensive evidence of criminal activity that prosecutors had presented. After 6 weeks of testimony and evidence, the case went to the jury on April 2, 1992. Deliberations lasted only 13 hours before the jury returned with verdicts that would reshape the landscape of American organized crime. John Gotti was found guilty on all counts, including racketeering, murder, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Frank Locascio was also convicted on all charges. The verdicts represented a complete victory for the prosecution and a devastating defeat for organized crime figures who had believed that their most successful boss was immune to prosecution. The sentences, imposed several months later, reflected the severity of the crimes and the defendants' leadership positions within the criminal organization. Gotti received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, effectively ending his criminal career and removing him permanently from any role in organized crime leadership. For Sammy Gravano, the successful prosecution represented both vindication and the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter in his life. His cooperation had achieved its intended purpose of bringing down John Gotti and demonstrating the government's ability to penetrate and prosecute even the most sophisticated criminal organizations. But it had also made him the most famous rat in the history of organized crime, a status that would follow him for the rest of his life and create ongoing security concerns that the witness protection program could only partially address. The trial established important precedents for future organized crime prosecutions and demonstrated that the Code of Omerta was not unbreakable when prosecutors could offer cooperating witnesses sufficient incentives and protections. It marked the beginning of a new era in the war between law enforcement and organized crime, one in which insider testimony would play an increasingly important role in dismantling criminal organizations. But for the participants, it represented something more personal and more final: the destruction of relationships, loyalties, and ways of life that had sustained them through decades of criminal activity. The world that had created both John Gotti and Sammy Gravano was changing in ways that none of them had anticipated. And the future would require adaptations that many would find impossible to make. The Witness Protection Program facility in an undisclosed location looked nothing like the federal prison where Sammy Gravano had spent the previous 2 years awaiting trial and providing testimony against his former associates. Instead of concrete cells and steel bars, there were comfortable living quarters, recreational facilities, and educational programs designed to help witnesses transition from their previous lives to new identities in a legitimate world. But for Sammy, the physical comfort of his new environment could not ease the psychological complexity of his situation. He had achieved his primary objectives. His testimony had resulted in John Gotti's conviction and life sentence. His own sentence had been reduced to just 5 years in prison, and his family had been provided with new identities and protection from retaliation by organized crime figures. But he had also destroyed everything that had given meaning to his adult life, burned bridges that could never be rebuilt, and entered a world where his past accomplishments meant nothing and his future prospects were uncertain. The Witness Protection Program, operated by the U.S. Marshal Service, was designed to provide new identities and secure relocations for witnesses whose testimony against dangerous criminals made them targets for retaliation. Participants received new names, new social security numbers, new birth certificates, and new personal histories that had been carefully constructed to conceal their previous identities while providing believable backgrounds for their new lives. For Sammy and his family, this meant becoming completely different people. Salvatore Gravano, underboss of the Gambino crime family, ceased to exist in any official capacity. In his place was Jimmy Moran, a middle-aged businessman from the Midwest, who had moved to Arizona to pursue opportunities in the construction industry. His wife Deborah became Lavra. Moran and their children received new names and carefully constructed personal histories that would allow them to attend school and pursue normal lives without fear of discovery. The transformation process was comprehensive and often emotionally difficult. Everything that connected them to their previous lives had to be abandoned or carefully concealed: family photographs, personal memorabilia, friendships, business, relationships, and even habits of speech or behavior that might reveal their true identities to observant strangers. For Deborah and the children, the adjustment was particularly challenging because they had not chosen this new life, but were adapting to it as a consequence of decisions made by someone else. They had enjoyed the prosperity and status that came with being part of a powerful crime family, but they had also lived with the constant stress and danger that such connections entailed. The Witness Protection Program offered them safety and the possibility of normal lives, but it required them to give up everything familiar and comfortable about their previous existence. Their new home was in Tempe, Arizona, a middle-class suburban community that was about as far removed from Brooklyn's organized crime environment as possible. The desert landscape, the casual social atmosphere, and the absence of the ethnic enclaves and neighborhood loyalties that had defined their previous world represented both freedom and isolation. Sammy's adjustment to legitimate business life was complicated by his lack of conventional credentials or experience in legal enterprises. While he had operated several legitimate businesses during his criminal career, these had primarily served as fronts for illegal activities or money laundering operations. His real expertise was in criminal enterprise intimidation and violence, skills that had little application in the legitimate business world. The Witness Protection Program provided some assistance with job placement and business development, but participants were expected to become self-sufficient as quickly as possible. For someone of Sammy's background and temperament, this meant trying to translate his leadership abilities and entrepreneurial instincts into legal enterprises that could generate sufficient income to maintain his family's standard of living. His first legitimate business venture was a small construction company that specialized in residential remodeling and commercial renovation projects. The construction industry was familiar territory for him, though operating within the constraints of legal business practices required significant adjustments in his approach to customer relations, employee management, and competitive practices. Gone were the days when he could resolve disputes through intimidation or eliminate competition through violence. Instead, he had to learn to compete through quality workmanship, competitive pricing, and customer service concepts that were familiar to him in theory, but challenging to implement after decades of relying on criminal methods to achieve business objectives. The legitimate construction business was also much less profitable than the criminal enterprises he had operated in New York, where his illegal activities had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually with minimal overhead costs. His legitimate business struggled to generate enough profit to support his family's lifestyle, while meeting the regulatory and tax obligations that legal businesses faced. More challenging was the social isolation that resulted from his inability to discuss his background or previous experiences with new acquaintances and business associates. The witness protection program required participants to maintain strict secrecy about their previous identities, which meant that developing genuine friendships or close business relationships was extremely difficult. When neighbors or colleagues asked about his background, his family, or his previous business experience, Sammy had to rely on the carefully constructed cover story that program officials had developed for him. He was Jimmy Moran from Ohio, who had worked in construction for 20 years before moving to Arizona to pursue new opportunities. His wife was a homemaker, his children were good students, and his life had been thoroughly ordinary and unremarkable. The psychological stress of maintaining this deception was enormous. Sammy had spent his entire adult life as someone who commanded respect and fear throughout his community, whose opinion mattered in important decisions, whose reputation opened doors and created opportunities. Now he was nobody special, just another middle-aged businessman struggling to make ends meet in a competitive market where his previous accomplishments meant nothing. The contrast was particularly stark when he watched news coverage of developments in the organized crime world he had abandoned. Former associates were being arrested, tried, and convicted based in part on testimony he had provided. The Gambino family was struggling to maintain its operations under increased law enforcement pressure and the loss of experienced leadership. The construction and waste management industries in New York were being transformed by federal investigations that had exposed the criminal cartels he had helped create and manage. From his perspective in Arizona, these developments validated his decision to cooperate with prosecutors and confirmed his assessment that the traditional organized crime model was becoming unsustainable in the face of modern law enforcement techniques, but they also reminded him daily of the world he had lost, the power he had abandoned, and the relationships he had destroyed. His children's adjustment to their new lives was easier in some ways and more difficult in others. They were young enough to adapt to new schools, new friends, and new social environments without the psychological baggage that affected their parents. But they also had to live with the knowledge that their father was one of the most famous criminals in American history, that their safety depended on maintaining false identities, and that they could never return to the places and people they had known during their early childhood. For Deborah, the adjustment was particularly challenging because she had to balance her loyalty to her husband with her concerns about the impact his decisions were having on their children's lives. She had supported his choice to cooperate with prosecutors when the alternative was life. Imprisonment, but she struggled with the ongoing consequences of that decision for their family's security and social relationships. The Witness Protection Program provided ongoing support and monitoring to ensure that participants remained safe and were successfully adapting to their new lives. Program officials maintained regular contact with the Gravano family, helped resolve problems that arose with their new identities, and monitored potential threats to their security from organized crime figures who might want to retaliate against Sammy's testimony. But the program could not solve the fundamental challenge that all participants faced: the need to build meaningful lives based on new identities while concealing the experiences and relationships that had shaped their previous existence. For someone like Sammy, who had spent 25 years as a major figure in organized crime, this challenge was particularly acute. By 1995, 3 years after entering the Witness Protection Program, the Gravano family had achieved a measure of stability in their new lives. Sammy's construction business was profitable, enough to support their basic needs. The children were doing well in school, and they had developed social relationships within their community. That provided some measure of normality. But the constraints and deceptions required by their new identities were taking a psychological toll that would eventually lead to decisions that jeopardized everything they had worked to build. The man who had once been one of the most powerful criminals in America was about to discover that escaping his past was much more difficult than he had anticipated, and that the legitimate world offered challenges and temptations that he was not equipped to handle. The next phase of Sammy Gravano's life would demonstrate that changing identities was easier than changing character, and that the skills and instincts that had made him successful in organized crime were not easily adapted to legitimate business and social relationships. The call came on a humid evening in July 1997, 5 years after Sammy Gravano had entered the Witness Protection Program and established what appeared to be a successful new life as a Jimmy Moran, legitimate businessman and suburban family man in Tempe, Arizona. But the voice on the other end of the line belonged to someone from his previous world, someone who had tracked him down. Despite all the precautions and security measures that were supposed to protect cooperating witnesses from contact with their former associates. "Hello, Sammy," the voice said, using his real name rather than the identity he had been living under for half a decade. "We need to talk." The caller was Michael Papa, a former Gambino family associate who had managed to avoid prosecution during the wave of arrests that had followed Sammy's cooperation. Papa had relocated to Phoenix and was operating what appeared to be legitimate businesses while maintaining connections to organized crime figures throughout the Southwest. For Sammy, the contact represented both a threat and an opportunity. On one hand, Papa's ability to locate him demonstrated that his new identity was not as secure as he had believed, raising concerns about his family's safety and the effectiveness of the Witness Protection Program. On the other hand, the call offered him a chance to reconnect with the world he had abandoned to reclaim some measure of the respect and excitement that had been missing from his legitimate business activities. "What do you want?" Sammy asked, carefully knowing that his phone might be monitored by federal agents responsible for his security. "I want to meet," Papa replied. "There are opportunities here that might interest you." Legitimate opportunities, he added, though the emphasis he placed on the word suggested otherwise. Against his better judgment, and in violation of Witness Protection Program rules, Sammy agreed to the meeting. It took place at a restaurant in Scottsdale, in a back booth where they could speak privately while maintaining the appearance of a casual business lunch between legitimate businessmen. What Papa offered was an entry into Arizona's rapidly growing club and bar scene, particularly establishments that catered to young adults interested in the emerging rave culture It was sweeping through major metropolitan areas throughout the country. The business appeared legitimate on the surface: nightclubs, restaurants, and entertainment venues that served legal clientele and generated revenue through conventional means. But Papa hinted at additional opportunities that were less conventional and more profitable. The rave scene was attracting young people who were interested in chemical enhancements to their nightlife experiences, creating demand for substances that were not available through traditional channels. Someone with the right connections and business acumen could develop very profitable enterprises, serving this market while maintaining the appearance of running legitimate entertainment businesses. The kids coming to these clubs have money, and they want to have good times, Papa explained. We can give them venues where they can party safely, and we can provide additional services that enhance their experiences. It's a perfect business model: high profit margins, loyal customers, and minimal law enforcement attention, because everything looks legitimate on the surface. For Sammy, the proposal was attractive for reasons that went beyond simple financial considerations. His construction business was successful enough to support his family, but it was boring routine and offered none of the excitement or respect that had characterized his previous criminal career, managing construction crews and bidding on remodeling projects was a far cry from the complex criminal enterprises that had once generated millions of dollars while commanding respect throughout the criminal underworld. More importantly, the legitimate business world offered limited opportunities for someone with his background and temperament. He was intelligent, ambitious, and accustomed to operating at high levels of authority and responsibility. But his lack of conventional credentials and his inability to discuss his previous business experience honestly made it difficult for him to pursue opportunities that matched his capabilities and aspirations. The club business offered a chance to operate in an environment that was more compatible with his personality and skills. Entertainment venues required the kind of leadership abilities, people management skills, and strategic thinking that had made him successful in organized crime. They also operated in a regulatory gray area that allowed for creative interpretations of laws and regulations, something that appealed to his entrepreneurial instincts. Against the explicit warnings of witness protection program officials, Sammy began developing business relationships with Papa and other figures who were involved in Arizona's emerging nightlife scene. He invested money from his construction business profits into a partnership that acquired several nightclubs and restaurants throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. The businesses were structured to appear completely legitimate. All necessary licenses and permits were obtained through proper channels. Employees were paid through conventional payroll systems, and taxes were filed on time and in full. But beneath this veneer of legitimacy, the clubs became centers for activities that were less conventional and more profitable. The key was understanding the culture and preferences of the young adults who frequented these establishments. Rave culture was built around all-night dance parties, electronic music, and chemical substances that enhanced the sensory experiences associated with loud music and flashing lights. The most popular of these substances was MDM, commonly known as ecstasy, which produced feelings of euphoria, increased energy, and enhanced sensory perception without the aggressive or violent side effects associated with other illegal drugs. Ecstasy was particularly well suited to the club environment because it made users more social, more affectionate, and more interested in dancing and music rather than fighting or causing problems. Users were generally peaceful, friendly, and focused on having positive experiences rather than creating the kinds of disturbances that attracted law enforcement attention to other types of illegal drug operations. For Sammy, the ecstasy trade represented an opportunity to apply his criminal enterprise skills to a market that was both highly profitable and relatively low risk compared to traditional organized crime activities. The customer base was affluent, willing to pay premium prices for quality products, and unlikely to cooperate with law enforcement. even if they were arrested for drug-related offenses. The supply chain was also more manageable than traditional drug trafficking operations. Ecstasy was manufactured in sophisticated laboratories, typically located in European countries, where the chemical precursors were more readily available. The finished product was compact, odorless, and easy to transport, making international smuggling operations much simpler than those required for bulkier drugs like marijuana or cocaine. Most importantly, from Sammy's perspective, the ecstasy trade operated in a legal and cultural gray area that provided some protection from aggressive law enforcement attention. Many police officers and prosecutors were unfamiliar with rave culture and MDMA, viewing them as less serious threats than traditional drug trafficking operations involving heroin, cocaine, or crack cocaine. This perception allowed Sammy's organization to operate with relatively little interference from law enforcement agencies that were focusing their resources on what they considered more serious drug problems. The clubs provided perfect cover for distribution operations. Since the presence of young people, obviously under the influence of chemical substances, could be explained as alcohol intoxication or the natural effects of loud music and physical exertion from dancing, by 1999, Sammy's Arizona operation had grown into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated millions of dollars annually while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity. The organization included several nightclubs and restaurants, a network of distributors who supplied ecstasy to customers throughout the Southwest, and connections to international suppliers who provided high-quality MDMA at wholesale prices. The operation was structured using many of the same organizational principles that had made his previous criminal enterprises successful. Authority and responsibility were clearly defined, with different individuals handling specific aspects of the business to minimize the risk that any single person's arrest or cooperation could compromise the entire organization. Financial records were carefully managed to separate legitimate business income from illegal drug profits, and money laundering operations ensured that criminal proceeds could be converted into apparently legal assets. But perhaps most importantly, Sammy applied the same strategic thinking and risk management techniques that had characterized his work with the Gambino family. He understood that successful criminal enterprises required careful attention to law enforcement patterns, community relations, and internal security measures that protected the organization from both external threats and internal betrayal. The success of the operation allowed Sammy to reclaim some measure of the lifestyle and respect that he had enjoyed during his years as a powerful organized crime figure. He drove expensive cars, wore costly jewelry, and lived in a mansion that reflected his newfound prosperity. More importantly, he was once again a person of significance within his community, someone whose opinions mattered and whose approval was sought by others involved in criminal enterprises. But the return to criminal activity also brought back the stresses and dangers that had characterized his previous life. Operating outside the law required constant vigilance against law enforcement, surveillance, careful management of criminal associates who might betray the organization for their own benefit, and ongoing concerns about violent competitors who might try to muscle in on profitable territory. The Witness Protection Program officials who were responsible for monitoring Sammy's activities began to notice changes in his behavior and lifestyle that suggested he might be involved in illegal activities. His construction business, while still operating, was no longer his primary focus. His social circle had expanded to include individuals with known criminal backgrounds, and his spending patterns were inconsistent with the income that his legitimate businesses could reasonably generate. More troubling were intelligence reports suggesting that Sammy Gravano, the cooperating witness whose testimony had helped convict John Gotti, was being discussed in wiretapped conversations between organized crime figures who were monitoring his activities with interest. If his new identity had been compromised, it raised serious questions about his security and the safety of his family. The federal agents assigned to his case began conducting their own surveillance of his activities, using many of the same techniques that had been employed against him during his years with the Gambino family. What they discovered was evidence of a criminal organization that was remarkably similar in structure and sophistication to the enterprises. He had operated in New York, adapted to different criminal markets and geographic conditions, but following essentially the same business model. The investigation that followed was comprehensive and methodical, reflecting the lessons that law enforcement agencies had learned from their previous experiences with Sammy's criminal enterprises. Rather than focusing on individual transactions or specific criminal acts, investigators sought to document the entire structure and operation of his organization using RICO statutes and other tools that had been developed specifically for prosecuting complex criminal enterprises. The evidence they assembled was extensive and damaging. Wiretapped conversations captured Sammy discussing drug transactions, money laundering operations, and other criminal activities in his own voice. Financial records traced the flow of money between his legitimate businesses and his illegal enterprises. Surveillance photographs documented meetings with known drug dealers and other criminal figures. Perhaps most damaging of all was testimony from several of his own associates who had been arrested on related charges and had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. These cooperating witnesses provided insider accounts of how the organization operated, what role Sammy played in its management, and how criminal proceeds were generated and distributed. The parallels to his previous prosecution were striking and deeply ironic. Once again, Sammy found himself facing RICO charges based on extensive electronic surveillance and testimony from cooperating witnesses. Once again, he was confronted with evidence that appeared overwhelming and difficult to challenge through conventional defense strategies. And once again, he was forced to consider whether cooperation with prosecutors might be his best option for avoiding life imprisonment. But this time, his situation was complicated by his previous cooperation agreement and his status as a protected witness. The government that had once relied on his testimony to convict Sean Gotti was now prosecuting him for violations of the agreement that had provided him with a reduced sentence and new identity. The irony was not lost on federal prosecutors, who found themselves in the unusual position of prosecuting their own star witness for criminal activities he had engaged in while supposedly living as a law-abiding citizen under government protection. The arrests came in February 2000 as coordinated raids swept through Arizona and several other states, targeting Sammy and dozens of his associates in what authorities described as one of the largest ecstasy distribution operations ever uncovered in the United States. The scale of the operation was staggering. Investigators estimated that the organization had distributed more than 25,000 ecstasy pills with a street value of several $1 million over a period of approximately 3 years. For Sammy, the arrest represented the collapse of everything he had worked to build since leaving the witness protection program. His legitimate businesses would likely be seized as proceeds of criminal activity. His family would once again face the uncertainty and danger associated with his criminal prosecutions, and his reputation as a cooperating witness would make him a target for violence from criminal associates who viewed his previous betrayal of John Gotti as evidence that he could not be trusted to maintain loyalty under pressure. But perhaps most significantly, the arrest demonstrated that, despite all his efforts to reinvent himself as a legitimate businessman, he had been unable to escape the criminal instincts and methods that had defined his adult life. The skills that had made him successful in organized crime had ultimately led him back into criminal activity, proving that changing identities was much easier than changing character. as he sat in a federal detention facility awaiting trial on charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. Sammy had to confront the reality that his decision to cooperate against John Gotti had not provided the new beginning he had hoped for. Instead, it had merely postponed a reckoning with the inevitable consequences of a lifetime devoted to criminal enterprise. The most famous cooperating witness in the history of organized crime was about to become a defendant once again, facing prosecution by the same federal system that had once protected and rewarded his cooperation. The wheel had come full circle, and the man who had betrayed the Gambino family to save himself was about to learn that salvation through betrayal was at best a temporary reprieve from the inevitable consequences of a life devoted to crime. The federal courthouse in Phoenix was a study in contrasts on the morning of October 2, 2002, as Sammy Gravano appeared for sentencing on charges related to his operation of what federal prosecutors described as one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking organizations ever uncovered in Arizona. Gone was the confident demeanor and expensive attire that had characterized his previous court appearances. In their place was a 57-year-old man in prison clothes, who looked older than his years, worn down by the accumulated weight of a lifetime of criminal activity and its consequences. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members who had come to witness the final chapter in one of the most remarkable criminal careers in American history. Sammy Gravano, the underboss who had brought down John Gotti, the cooperating witness whose testimony had revolutionized organized crime prosecution, and the protected witness who had returned to criminal activity despite having been given a new life by the federal government, was about to learn his fate. The prosecution's case had been overwhelming and virtually impossible to defend. Wiretapped conversations captured Sammy discussing drug transactions and money laundering operations in detail. Financial records traced millions of dollars in criminal proceeds through his various business enterprises. Dozens of witnesses, including several of his own associates, had testified about his role in managing a criminal organization that distributed thousands of ecstasy pills throughout the Southwest. Perhaps most damaging of all was the evidence demonstrating that his criminal activities had begun almost immediately after he had entered the witness protection program, suggesting that his cooperation with federal prosecutors had been motivated more by self-preservation than by any genuine commitment to abandoning his criminal lifestyle. His defense attorney had argued that Sammy was a man who had been unable to escape the criminal culture that had shaped his entire adult life, that his return to illegal activities was the result of psychological and social pressures that made legitimate life impossible for someone with his background. But the argument carried little weight with prosecutors and judges who viewed his criminal activities as a betrayal of the trust that had been placed in him when he was given a second chance through the witness protection program. District Judge Elaine Ross, who presided over the sentencing, had reviewed extensive materials about Sammy's criminal history, his cooperation with federal prosecutors, and his subsequent return to criminal activity. Her comments during the sentencing hearing reflected both her understanding of his complex history and her judgment about what justice required in his particular case. Mr. Gravano, she began, looking directly at him as he stood before the bench. You have lived an extraordinary life, though not one that anyone should want to emulate. You rose to the highest levels of organized crime in America, participating in 19 murders and countless other violent crimes that terrorized honest citizens and corrupted legitimate businesses. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. When you were facing life imprisonment for those crimes, the government offered you an opportunity that few criminals ever receive the chance to cooperate, to tell the truth about your activities, and to begin a new life under federal protection. Your testimony was valuable to law enforcement and helped convict some of the most dangerous criminals in America. The judge's tone became more stern as she addressed his subsequent criminal activities. But instead of using that opportunity to become a productive member of society, you chose to return to criminal activity. Almost immediately after entering the Witness Protection Program, you organized and managed a sophisticated drug trafficking operation that generated millions of dollars in illegal profits while corrupting young people and contributing to the drug problems that plague our communities. Judge Ross sentenced Sammy to 20 years in federal prison, a term that would keep him incarcerated until he was nearly 80 years old. The sentence reflected both the seriousness of his drug trafficking activities and his violation of the cooperation agreement that had provided him with a reduced sentence for his previous crimes. But perhaps more significantly, the sentence represented a final judgment on a life that had been defined by choices between legitimate opportunities and criminal enterprises, between loyalty and betrayal, between redemption and recidivism. At every crucial decision point, Sammy had chosen the path that led deeper into criminal activity, even when alternatives were available that might have led to legitimate success and social acceptance. His family members who were present at the sentencing appeared devastated by the outcome, understanding that they would once again face years of uncertainty, financial hardship, and social stigma associated with their relationship to one of America's most notorious criminals. His children, now adults, had spent most of their lives dealing with the consequences of their father's criminal activities and the notoriety that came with being related to such a controversial figure. Deborah, his wife of more,